Right. Well, good morning, everyone. I'll now open this hearing session. My name is Alistair Edwards. I'm a reporter with the Scottish Government's Planning and Environmental Appeals Division. I've been appointed, along with my colleague Martin Seddon, to conduct an examination of the proposed Aberdeen City and Shire Strategic Development Plan. Now, can I ask parties around the table to introduce themselves? Can you say who you are, who you represent, and what your position is in that organisation? And I'll start here.
Tom Walsh, Aberdeen City and Shire Strategic Development Planning Authority, and I'm a Senior Planner.
Sheena Lamont, Senior Planner, Aberdeen City and Shire Strategic Development Planning Authority.
Paul Finch, Aberdeenshire Council Strategic Transportation Manager.
Ken Neal, Aberdeen City Council Senior Engineer in the Transport Strategy and Programmes team.
Jeff Davidson, Sistra, I'm Associate Director.
Jennifer Anderson, Nestrands, I'm a Transport Executive for Programmes and Delivery.
David Torrance, Transport Scotland, I'm Acting Head of Regional Transport and Development Planning.
Thank you. And just to confirm, we're not joined today by Joanna Murray, from the Transport Leader from Aberdeen City Council. Is that correct? And we're also not joined today by Rab Dixon, Transport Strategy Manager from Nestrands. Is that right? Right, you'll notice today we're joined in the audience by colleagues of mine, Ewan and Shree, who are filming proceedings today. You'll see me talking with them about the process, but they'll take no part in our reasoning or our recommendations into the examination. Now, before I explain how we intend to proceed, there are a few formalities. So, firstly, can everybody hear me okay? Brilliant. We're being filmed today. This is simply to allow a record of proceedings and allow access to the hearing for those with an interest. The camera works by focusing on the microphone in use. So, with that in mind, you need to switch on the microphone, which you've all done perfectly well so far, and remember to turn it off once you finish speaking. Okay, any questions about filming before we proceed? No. Okay. If you have a mobile phone, if you can make sure that's on silent or at least on vibrate during proceedings, that would be much appreciated. There's no fire test today, so if the fire alarm does go, it's for real. If you just exit the way that you came in, if that way is blocked at the main entrance, there is an exit to the right. Now, today is the first hearing session which we're holding as part of the examination of the plan. The examination is still in its infancy, so there may well be a requirement for further processes, including further written submissions and potential for further hearing sessions. Today we'll be considering transport interventions and delivery. Having studied the proposed plan together with the unresolved representations on this topic and the Council's response to those, the authority's response to those, I opted to arrange this hearing session early in the examination process to allow a full understanding of parties' positions. The purpose of the hearing session is to clarify the positions of Transport Scotland, the Strategic Development Planning Authority and its partners. For efficiency, I chose not to request hearing statements, but asked parties to concentrate on the unresolved representation from Transport Scotland and the response from the authority as set out in the Schedule 4 submitted as part of the examination, specifically Issue 3, our Spatial Strategy General, and Issue 18, our Connections. There are also a suite of documents and guidance as well as transport appraisal material which are relevant to the matters that we'll discuss today. Now, before I go on, in particular, Mr. Torrance, have you had an opportunity to review the Schedule 4 for Issue 3 and 18 before today? You have. No problem. The hearing session will take the form of a structured discussions, which I shall lead following the questions on the agenda as a guide. I've put a copy of the agenda in front of everybody, so you should have a copy. Nodding heads, good. Although I shall invite particular people to contribute to the discussion at appropriate times, I'd welcome comments and questions from any of you as the discussion progresses. Please note there will be no formal presentation of cases or cross-examination. Now, depending on progress, we'll break for lunch and resume afterwards, although it may be possible that we can conclude our discussions prior to lunch. Now, are there any questions before we proceed? No? Great. Right, so we've had our welcome and introductions. So moving on to item 2 in the agenda, an explanation of the progression of the proposed SDP in relation to cumulative transport appraisal and transport interventions. Now, as we go on, I'll be typing, so you'll have to give me a moment just to type as I hear your responses to the questions and answers as we go. Just give me a second. Now, firstly, could the authority explain the history of transport appraisals and investigations in relation to development planning in Aberdeen City and Aberdeenshire? Now, before you continue, it's my understanding that the spatial strategy promoted in the proposed strategic development plan is a continuation of that presented in the 2009 structure plan and the extant development plan of 2014. So if you could take me from the period from the 2009 structure plan up to today, that'd be most appreciated.
I'll lead on this. Okay. You may want that. Would be helpful. It's just a little time plan. Yeah. It's not a formal submission, but it's just a. Well, I've got one. If David wants one, he can have one as well. Sorry. Yeah.
Thanks. If you could show Mr. Torrance that document now, and I'll ask him if he's happy for me to have a look at it, and then we can continue on that basis.
Happy, yes.
Yes, you can submit that, thank you. And could you provide an electronic copy for the record? Okay, Mr. Ross, thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. First of all, I'd just like to say thank you to my colleagues from Aberdeen City Council and Aberdeen Shire Council and Nestrans for coming here today to work in partnership with us. This has been a partnership document and process so far, so we appreciate their support and input into it. As requested, an overview of or a timeline of the previous structure plans leading up to the proposed 2018 structure plan. It began, or the first plan that the Aberdeen City and Shire Strategic Development Planning Authority had approved was the structure plan of 2009. This was the inception of the spatial strategy, and that was based around strategic growth areas. So there was 4 strategic growth areas. There was Aberdeen City, one heading north to Peterhead, one heading towards Huntly, and then one going south towards Lawrencekirk. This was then followed by a cumulative transport appraisal in 2010, which was based on corridor appraisals. The 2009 structure plan set housing allowances for each corridor, and the modelling that the cumulative transport appraisal in 2010 was based on followed the allowances that was set in the 2009 structure plan. What followed from this was the Aberdeen City Local Development Plan 2012 and the Aberdeen Shire Local Development Plan 2012, and these were supported by the 2010 Cumulative Transport Appraisal. What followed on from then was the change from structure plans to strategic development plans. So the Aberdeen City and Shire Strategic Development Plan was approved in March of 2014, and what followed on from then was the new set of local development plans under 2014 Scottish Planning Policy. So that was the Aberdeen City Local Development Plan and the Aberdeen Shire Local Development Plan. And those would still have been in line with the housing allowances that came from the 2000 structure plan and the cumulative transport appraisal. Part of the structure plan, Strategic Development Plan of 2014 stated that it would come forward with supplementary guidance relating to the funding of strategic transportation. So the 2009 structure plan had considerable allowances because at that period of time we foresaw that there would be a huge amount of growth given the robustness of the economy in the northeast, and that was reflected then again in the 2014 plan carried forward. So for those strategic sites to come forward, there was a feeling that there was a level of transportation interventions required to support those and to mitigate their impact on the network. The Strategic Transportation Fund supplementary guidance was approved by Council, but within the 6-week period was appealed and taken to the Court of Session, and it was quashed at the Court of Session. Strategic Development Planning Authority was granted leave to appeal, and we appealed it to the Supreme Court, but this was again quashed in October 2017. So the supplementary guidance is no longer part of the development plan. Between the 2014 plan and obviously the work that has gone on for the 2018 plan, there's been some other issues and work that we've had to work through as an organisation. So the Strategic Transportation Fund court case obviously was something that we were very invested in, because it was the only supplementary guidance that came from the 2014 plan, and we really needed to find out what was going to happen with that and how that would inform the next proposed strategic development plan. There was also the review of planning going on at the same time, which was talking about change in the development plan, and then we were working on the upgrade to the TAMOS Transport Economic Land Use Model of Scotland, and following on from that, the Aberdeen sub-area model. So Jeff will speak more to that in a moment. So those needed to be, the Strategic Transportation Fund needed to be concluded, and also the work undergoing on TAMOS and ASAM needed to be concluded as well. In March of 2018, we produced and consulted on the Aberdeen City and Shire main issues report. And this was supported by a cumulative transport appraisal. Then, over the course of the summer, after the consultation, after we'd fed in comments from that consultation, we moved towards the production of the proposed strategic development plan, and that was supported by a cumulative transport appraisal which contained a list of potential schemes. Following on from the consultation of the proposed strategic development plan, our colleagues at Aberdeen City and Aberdeen Shire cannot produce a main issues report for their local development plans until a proposed strategic development plan has been produced and submitted. So we worked towards submitting that for examination, and that was earlier this year in April when we submitted it. Working in parallel to that, the cumulative transport appraisal work didn't stop. The cumulative transport appraisal work took the preferred bid site numbers, which reflected the proposed allocations in the proposed strategic development plan, and factored those into the final part of the cumulative transport appraisal, so they were able to test the potential schemes listed in the CTA against the allocations in the Aberdeen City and Aberdeen Shire local development plan main issues reports. No problem.
Sorry, Mr. Ross, it's very helpful so far. Just to confirm, I am going to come on to this later, and I'm very interested to learn about the TELMOS and the ASMA. I will come on to that in a minute. But you just said there, which is interesting to me, you submitted a document, we'll come on to it later, to do with this options testing of the cumulative transport appraisal, which has passed by your board recently. Now, that's what you've just described, and what you're telling me there is that the cumulative transport appraisal was continuing, and on the basis of the main issues reports for the local development plans, that's what the testing looked at. Is that right? So it was looking at more specific allocations.
Yeah. So if you compare the previous CTA in 2010 to the current CTA, we feel there would be a greater level of accuracy. So in the 2009 structure plan, there were allowances based on a corridor basis, but it wasn't site specific, because obviously strategic development plans don't make allocations. We don't deal with specific sites, we only deal with allowances. So what we have in this plan is the first part of the CTA, which Jeff will talk about in a moment, deals with the global number that's in the proposed strategic development plan. And that's based around what goes into strategic growth areas between housing market areas or between Aberdeen and Aberdeen City and Aberdeen Shire. But the second part of the CTA takes the numbers from the main issues report. So it's site specific, so it knows exactly where and the quantum of housing and where that will actually feed into the transport network. So rather than it being disaggregated on a proportional basis across Assam zones, it's actually site specific. So we feel it's a more accurate assessment of what the impact would be on the transport network.
And sorry, what happens in a hearing? We get a bit of a flow between the issues and the items on the agenda. So just to pick up on that, just for me, I need to be clear in this. So the current board report that you put out, the CTA transport options, which has packages involved in it, that is based on the main issues reports of the local development plans.
Yes.
Right, that's explained the situation to now quite aptly for me. Mr. Torrance, before I ask the authority to explain some of the other reports and modelling that's been involved, could I just ask you, in terms of this cumulative transport appraisal, and there's two stages we've heard of, stage 1, 2018, stage 2, which has been completed recently, does that give Transport Scotland any greater clarity or reassurance in terms of funding, deliverability and feasibility, the issues that I think you're concerned about?
I think what we do in the first instance is just add to some of what Tom's set out there, to note that Transport Scotland has been directly involved in a lot of that earlier development work, very supportive of the principles that have been taken forward through the 2010 appraisal, helped effectively develop the Assam models, the Telmos model, something that we hold within Transport Scotland. That's something that has been used extensively to inform this. So in terms of the principle and the process, up to a certain point in all this modelling and cumulative transport appraisal work, we are supportive of that approach that has been taken. I think the question you just asked as to whether the current versions of the cumulative transport appraisals have informed the plans that we would, in a way that we would expect, I think the answer is unfortunately still not quite the way that we interpret SDP. So no is the short answer on that one. And the 2014 plan, for example, gave specifics and then had the strategic transport fund associated with it in terms of the delivery, accepting that from cost and obviously the background to that. But we would still expect to see strategic development plans setting out the kind of key pieces of infrastructure on the transport side of things, or policies or whatever it was, which would be required to deliver that level of development, and also set out how those are to be funded and delivered. And that's essentially where we are in our representation at the moment.
Right, we'll come back to Mr. Torrance's concerns as we go through the agenda. Cascade Authority, could you just explain the interaction with the Transport Economics Land Use Model of Scotland? It's been abbreviated to Telmos 14. I'm assuming that's the 2014 version, but maybe you could explain that further. And also, could you explain the Aberdeen sub-area model and in relation to these transport appraisals, how they work?
I will leave the detailed explanation of that to Jeff from Sistra.
So the Aberdeen sub-area model, Assam.
I'll just check. Can you hear? Yeah.
Is that good? So the Aberdeen sub-area model, Assam, is the regional multimodal model for the northeast of Scotland. Covers Aberdeen, Aberdeenshire, parts of Moray and Angus. that looks at traffic flows in 2014, public transport volumes, congestion in 2014, and is able to forecast traffic impacts over time by adding in particular land uses, population, houses, employment. Determines how those movements might move across the network. Also distinguishes the impacts of committed transport interventions, such as AWPR, Kintour Railway Station, volume sensitivity, and so on. From that, you can assess the future networks, what impact the transport schemes have, what impact the development has, and you can identify problems, opportunities, issues, and constraints. The TELMOS model is also linked to the Transport Model of Scotland. That's a strategic transport model covering the whole of Scotland. It provides demographic, housing, employment forecasts for Scotland at a kind of larger geographical area, zones or areas. And they're used to feed in strategic growth into the ASAM model and also determine how population demography might change over time. So we effectively take the kind of more coarser outputs and longer term outputs from the TELMOS model and then disaggregate them in more detail into the ASAM model to investigate traffic impacts and public transport impacts over time.
Oh, sorry, I've had my mic on the whole time. So in this case, both the TELMOS feeds into the ASAM, and the ASAM is fed into your CTA. Is that right?
Yes.
And just going back to what you said, Mr. Torrance, you have no issue with that process in terms of using TELMOS, feeding into the ASAM, and feeding into the cumulative transport appraisal. I'll get you to move your mic slightly toward you.
No issue with that technical process at all. No.
Okay, now moving on, Transport Scotland, I take it you've been involved as a partner consultee for each of the transport appraisals since 2009. Is that correct?
That's correct, yes.
And have you had any issue with the previous appraisals that have been conducted, or is it just at this stage? I mean, you alluded to a minute ago that you were fairly happy with 2014 modelling and the outcome from the strategic development plan that's extant at the minute. Is that right?
That's correct. So again, just reiterate what I said earlier on, is that we don't really have any issue with the technical approach that's been taken here. There's no different way really to do it, and it's been proven before that we've been happy with that approach. It's how the outcomes of that are reported within the plan and the stages that's been reported within the plan, and how that fits or not with the requirements of SDP and the DPM guidance that Transport Scotland produced, which are linked with SDP.
Thank you. We're going to come back to that. Now, before we move on to item 3, is there anything that anybody else would like to add in terms of item 2?
I suppose I would go back to the Strategic Transportation Fund, in that it was noted in the 2014, as David says correctly, that the authority would produce supplementary guidance on that. And it is obviously quashed now. I suppose I'd just like to clarify, is Transport Scotland's issue with delivery related to historically permitted development that has come through the 2009, 2012 local development plans, 2014 strategic development plan, and later development plans that has permission, or is it with what is in the additional allowances that are in the proposed 2018 plan?
It's both. I suppose that the plan should be looking at existing consented development allocations that are already sitting there, and then the additional allocations on top of that, and understanding what infrastructure is required to deliver that quantum of development over the plan period. So that's where we are.
Yes, it's the issue of robust and credible in terms of the actual modelling that's been carried out. At the 2014 Strategic Development Plan, the view of Transport Scotland, which was reported in the examination report, said while Transport Scotland view was that while the interventions that have been identified at this stage have not been subject to detailed appraisal, design and feasibility work, they have emerged out of a process that Transport Scotland has stated, in brackets, in response to a further information request, which would have been by the reporter, is suitably robust for this tier of plan making. Transport Scotland was also of the view that the cumulative transport appraisal that has been carried out is by recognised professional consultants in association with Transport Scotland as well as the local authorities. We would say that we've built on that robust position. We've informed the model with more detailed information regarding site information. So given that we haven't changed in any way radically the spatial strategy, the model at this point in time remains robust and accurate and credible. And the biggest piece of kit on the network that will have changed the model substantially is the AWPR, and we need data survey of that after a period of time when the road's in place. There's a need for monitoring and evaluation, which Transport Scotland commissioned, but which the STPA with Nestrans and the local transport authorities are commissioning through the city region deal to actually update modelling at that local level, because that's the biggest impact in terms of the transport movement, any significant transport movement. The other aspect of it is that the plan at 2009 stage and the 2014 stage was very generous in the allocations, the anticipated demand in terms of housing land. That has been very slow to come forward. It was based on a pre-oil industry downturn. So many of the things that are in the current model and that were in the previous model are a worst case scenario in terms of what might occur on the strategic transport network. In turn, the strategic transport network has radically changed, not the rail network, but the road network, in terms of potential interaction between strategic and local flows. So we would say that the next big change that needs to happen in terms of modelling is to import new data to inform a model. And at this point in time, we're working with historic data. We always work with historic data, and then we make assumptions in terms of what will happen in the future. And at the moment, we're working on the 2014, which was very generous and hasn't delivered according to plan. So therefore, the modelling outputs as they are just now are as credible and robust as they were in 2014. In fact, you could say they are more because there's additional data in there. So it's difficult to understand how we've actually moved from a credible and robust situation at the 2014 position, which was based on 2010 data at that time, and the 2018 which is now based on 2000 more recent information is considered less credible. So we're kind of struggling with this a bit.
We're going to come on in a second to what the transport appraisal actually says, and I know it does say things about the Aberdeen Western Peripheral Road. We can come on to that if required, but my understanding at the core of this is not that the modelling is flawed, not that the outputs are flawed. It seems to be to do with, does it comply with Scottish planning policy and the DPM tag, which we're going to come on to, and what does that say and what does it mean? And we'll have a look at that in detail. So it's not to do with the modelling, it's my understanding. It seems to be doing with the wording of the plan and how much certainty that provides in terms of feasibility and deliverability and funding. And what I'd like to do, and we're going to come on to this later, is look at the wording of the extant plan and look at the wording of the proposed plan. And they do differ, and it's a question of to what extent the concern is of Transport Scotland in how they differ. Is that a fair summary of your concern, Mr. Torrance?
Yes, I would agree with that. That it's not about the modelling part of the appraisal being robust and credible. We are happy with that process as it stands. Yes, there's work ongoing. Yes, there's future work to happen once we get information to inform it. But we're happy that the modelling exercise is using the best available data we have at the time. It's what you do with that and what you do with the outputs of that, as we've just described, to set in the plan context and kind of define what interventions may or may not be required.
I think that's useful, so we can draw a line. This is not like we're going to talk about other strategic development plan authorities at the moment, but we're not in a situation where we're talking about that you haven't done a cumulative transport appraisal, that you haven't followed that process. That's correct, Mr. Torrance. Yes. So it's really to do with how does the plan respond to that cumulative transport appraisal, and how do we look at deliverability in the future. So we'll come on to that as we go through the agenda. Now, can we move on to item 3? Would that be okay? Any more for item 2? No? Okay. So item 3 is a brief overview of the cumulative transport appraisal and future studies. So could the authority provide a brief, and I mean a brief, it's a 200-page document, so a brief overview of the findings of the cumulative transport appraisal and the review of transport interventions?
Yep, sure. So the condensed version. We set out in the report published in August 2018. We set out the impacts forecasts across the network based on the planning allocations in quite detail. We looked at the benefits produced by several committed transport interventions, such as AWPR, and we reported the problems, opportunities, issues and constraints across the network in relation to that build-out of development and the benefits of the new schemes.
Sorry to cut you off there. You've used particular phrasing there, probably on purpose. That's what SPP requires you to do, is that right?
So DPM tag sets out to align with STAG guidance as well, and the main issue is evidence-led rather than solution-led. So you look at the problems, opportunities, issues and constraints, are the 4 aspects, and that you build up a set of objectives to solve those issues, and then you test the impact of the network against those objectives, plus the packages or the schemes put forward to solve the problems, the identified solutions you test them against those objectives, along with a set of STAG criteria in terms of deliverability and feasibility and the environment and so on. So with that evidence of problems and issues, we identified transport schemes or some policies that would be potentially solve or mitigate some of the impacts from development, and then we undertook an appraisal. We packaged those schemes up into 3 packages. The first package was some of the smaller level schemes, junction improvements and policy initiatives of active travel plus priority. Second package was a set of rail stations to try and encourage public transport use and better accessibility. And the third scheme was built on the second package with more ambitious road upgrades, junction upgrades, and changes to the network. So the second stage of the report analyses the impacts of those packages, the benefits, to see if they address some of the issues within the area. Overall, the modelling shows that there's significant benefits from the committed transport schemes such as AWPR into a rail station. There's growth in rail travel across the network, and the AWPR alleviates a significant level of congestion across the area. Some of those benefits are eroded as traffic grows over time from the build-out of new development. And what we see is the need for further intervention The packages identified, package 1, is kind of quite specific in terms of areas, and some of the impacts of development are mitigated to a reasonable degree from the introduction of those schemes. Some are outstanding; they don't have a significant impact or significant benefit. Package 2 builds on package 1 in terms of encouraging more public transport use, but doesn't significantly alleviate some of the congestion issues. Package 3 has particular benefits in some areas of Aberdeen and Aberdeenshire, but it's a more mixed picture with some of the low-hanging fruit already mitigated within packages 1 and 2.
Okay, and I think you've already talked about, so your second stage, that looked at the main issues reports from the local development plans, and that informed these 3 packages and the outcomes.
Yes, so the detailed local development sites were added into the modelling, so to be a bit more specific with access strategies, and we were able to predict the level of traffic generated and travel generated from those sites, and their impact on the network was modelled in a greater level of detail.
Sorry, just to understand, at the main issues report stage, obviously it's not the settled view of the council, so it may change. So is this the preferred options for housing, employment, growth that the 2 authorities are looking at?
Yeah, they would be the preferred options. Yep.
Right. You've explained the recent board decision to approve the cumulative transport appraisal testing, so I don't think we need to cover that any further. Now, as already discussed, it's my understanding, and I think you've confirmed, that the proposed plan promotes the same spatial strategy as the structure plan and the strategic development plan. The only difference is the exact location of new allocations for housing and employment, but not the general location. Although you've just told me, and I understood this morning, that the MIRs have been used to inform the most recent CTA testing. So in essence, development's directed to strategic growth areas, and that's highlighted in paragraph 2.3 of the proposed plan. But I would say the authority are arguing that it's for the local development plans and associated transport appraisals to respond once the site-specific allocations are known and presented in the MIR those plans. Is that correct?
They have a more detailed position, so yeah. I suppose what we said in our schedule for response, and I'll say it again now, is that we would take the view that the development plan is the whole development plan. We don't look at the strategic development plan in isolation from the local development plan. We look at it from a holistic point of view. So that is why we've taken that view. And if you look at the timeline there, you will see that the CTA was between the strategic development plan and for the 2010 plan. You'll see that the CTA is between the 2 plans. We have a better view of where the development is by taking the preferred sites from the main issues reports.
On that, I mean, when was the and Mr. Torrance, you might be able to. When was the DPM tag guidance issued? There isn't a date on it.
2011 is my understanding, and SBP came into force in 2014.
So the process of producing the structure plan, followed by a cumulative transport appraisal to inform the LDPs, that's in a situation before we had the DPM tag and SPP. Yes. So, I mean, the process now is more that you've done your cumulative transport appraisal in advance of the SDP proposed plan being produced. So there's a slight change. Yes.
there is a timeline in DPM tag, I think, at the back. Sorry. Should be able to find it here. Page 16. And there's different stages. Not everything always marries up perfectly. If you're under the statutory clock to review your strategic development plan, and strategic development plans need to be reviewed every 4 years, not every 5 years like local development plans, so we have less time to work with than a local development plan would. So, I mean, our primary concern is that we manage to produce, and the primary function of the Strategic Development Planning Authority is to review and produce a strategic development plan. So that is where we sit. We follow the Act and we follow the circular, and that's where our focus is. Yeah.
Mr. Torrance, do you have anything to add before I ask a few more questions?
Just briefly on the timelines that are set out within EPM tag, the appraisal process and the principles of that process are effectively that the transport appraisal and the land use considerations should be undertaken at roughly the same time. The reason for that being that obviously land use choices can influence transport, and vice versa. If you have transport interventions or impacts, you could potentially take a different land use choice. So the suggestion within the DPM tag guidance is that at main issues report stage, you should be fairly far through your appraisal process to understand what the impacts of your potential range of land use options are, and therefore your transport appraisal can be part of your consideration, not your own consideration obviously, but can be part of your consideration of how you select your growth corridors, how you select your particular areas of growth or sites and local development plans, and therefore it can inform the process going forward. I completely accept what Tom's saying in terms of the timescales don't always tie up for a whole range of reasons. Modelling takes time if you have to do that as part of the process. There's information which comes on board during a process which has to be taken on board. But the principle should remain that the transport impacts should inform the land use choices, and when you've made those land use choices through the next stages of the plan, after the main issues report, it should then be for the plan to set out how you're actually going to mitigate and deliver the infrastructure that's required for your chosen spatial strategy.
Yes, sorry.
Yes, I mean, DPM tag does actually put an idealised timeline on that, that it does inform the main issues stage. However, as we've highlighted, is that this is a continuation of an existing spatial strategy. We are working with effectively the same numbers in the same locations with the same package, which was established in 2009 through the Regional Transport Strategy, which has been gone through 2 ministerial approvals since that date. So while we could have run another package, it costs money to run the modelling exercises. And where there is not much substantial change other than the significant AWPR route, then you could, I mean, DPM tag does say these idealised timelines, but it does actually say where this is the case and where that is the case, and we can cover that in more detail later. It's not a specific, you must do it. It does give, unless you have, this is the case and that is the case, then you can dispense with that. But that's the critical thing, is that we have a model. We have a model that's become more informed. It's become more robust, in Transport Scotland's words. And given that we've had such a volume of land available, we're not promoting anything substantially different. And you do not go and do a modelling exercise in something that isn't substantially different. You've got the same spatial strategy, the same volume of housing, the same package of proposals, which were part of the AWPR package of proposals that were in the Regional Transport Strategy. they're all still there. The AWPR being delivered might allow that to move forward across the piece in terms of transport as well as development. But at the moment, we've been in a very slow changing situation, both in terms of not, I would say, getting transport infrastructure in, because the amount of infrastructure that's actually been brought forward beyond the AWPR is quite significant and has been achieved without the SPA. So where we are is actually to carry out a modelling exercise to meet the timeline stipulated but not set in stone, and DPM tag would be, it could be considered a waste of public money to spend money doing modelling exercises that are not essential to inform the plan, and that's what it's about. It's supposed to inform the plan.
Mm-hmm. Sorry, could I just add to something Sheena was saying? In terms of the timelines, when DPM tag talks about, I think, it's core document 14, and it's paragraph 1.5. Transport impacts should therefore be considered early in the process of identifying sites for development. We don't identify sites. We do allowances at a strategic level. So I think we understand Transport Scotland's concerns about interventions at specific sites, but we are at a higher level. We're at that strategic level. The other, in terms of how we feel we conform with SPP, it's paragraph. Yeah, we'll go back to it. Yeah.
Come back to that specifically. At the minute, I'm just looking at the transport appraisal and future studies. So we'll come back to and we'll put it down at the minute. But I think I heard you say there that it's the same range of interventions as before. And if you can, we'll just think about that, and we'll come back to it. So, because I'd like to understand, are there any new interventions, or does it remain the same? Right now. Paragraph 3.40 of the proposed plan refers to a strategic transport appraisal that will accompany the city deal. Could you explain how does that, or does it, fit with the delivery of the proposed transport interventions set out in the proposed plan?
Okay, so in October 2016, the local authorities, Aberdeen City, Aberdeen Shire, and Transport Scotland, Scottish Government, and the UK government agreed a city-region deal for the Aberdeen region. This is the second city-region deal that was agreed in Scotland, following on from Glasgow. And as part of that deal, there were two specific transport measures included within the deal. One was investment in a new roads infrastructure because of the new harbour that was being constructed to the south of Aberdeen South Harbour, and there was a feeling that the wider regional benefits could be achieved through an upgrade to that road, and that was to be undertaken via a stag process, and that's ongoing. The other piece of work for me is far more interesting, because it was agreed with Transport Scotland in 2016 to invest £7 million into a strategic transport appraisal, looking at quite a lot of these issues that we're talking about now, following the stag process, including an upgrade, help to upgrade the model, the ASAM model, to look at the impacts of the economic growth arising from the city-region deal, looking at the impacts of the development plans, tying together better transport and the development plans, and looking at issues such as gateways into Aberdeen, some of the key strategic corridors, and taking it forward on there, looking at this bigger issue of connectivity across the region to achieve planning goals, transport goals, and economic development goals. So that's the work that we're undertaking at the moment. I would argue that the suite of work that we've been talking about here, the cumulative transport appraisal, the modelling exercises, all form within this wider environment of the strategic transport appraisal, although it hasn't always been directly funded from there. We've done the initial modelling upgrade to give us the 2014 model, which is fantastic, because it's good, better, accurate forecasts of where the traffic problems are. We've commissioned consultants to give us a detailed understanding of problems, opportunities, it's in the same language that Jeff was using, actually, but perhaps on a broader level, not constraining itself to the planning. And the cumulative transport appraisal work that has been done has been a fantastic resource to inform that. We've also now undertaken an option generation and shortlisting exercise, and we're about to go to the next stage of appraisal. Now, transport planning and appraisal is sometimes a little bit it's integrated. It should be integrated. So we've got to be aware that at the same time that we're doing this, Nestrans are reviewing their regional transport strategy, because we need to understand, we need to move beyond now we have the AWPR, the Aberdeen Western Peripheral Route. What's the next 20, 30 years going to look like? Because all the transport strategies up to then have always been looking to the AWPR and things like that. So that's what we've been looking at now. And Nestrans are working in a parallel process with the Strategic Transport Appraisal to update their regional transport strategy. It's parallel with the Strategic Development Plan, doing their work as well on the land use process and a new regional economic strategy as well. We also need to be aware that at the very same time that we're doing this, Transport Scotland are undertaking their own review of the National Transport Strategy, and they also have a parallel process looking at a Strategic Transport Projects review. So if you're into transport appraisal at the time, it's very exciting. There's an awful lot of things going on, and we have a huge evidence base of previous studies looking at particular schemes that are fed into the regional transport strategies, but we're also looking at a bigger picture of some of the options going forward. But interestingly, what we have found is in terms of the infrastructure, in terms of schemes, often it is a continuation, it is a realisation of schemes that have already been in place and been talked about, such as the one that Jeff was talking about in terms of the rail stations and some of these corridor upgrades that are now coming through. And possibly the new elements to the regional transport strategy has been the change on behaviour change and trying to predict the issues of new technologies. And I think that would be fair to say in terms of what we're looking at now in terms of regional transport strategy. Whereas perhaps the cumulative transport appraisal has been, it would be harsh to call it, but I could say it's predict and provide. We see that as a do minimum, and the challenge regionally is actually that if that's a worst case scenario, how can we use the travel behaviour change tools, parking management, the revitalised city centre, to actually go beyond and actually mitigate some of the impacts in a more intelligent manner, rather than just always relying on new infrastructure, although we are well aware that new infrastructure will always be an element of ensuring that an area such as Aberdeenshire is well connected and can provide the infrastructure that is sought after for economic growth goals. So that's the bigger picture of the strategic transport appraisal. We're working our way through this, and there's a whole suite of studies and ongoing work that supports that at the moment, and is also interrelated with the development plan, Nestrans strategy, and the cumulative transport appraisal. Does that help?
I'm going to ask another question and come back to what you've said. So there's also within your cumulative transport appraisal testings options paper, the report to the board mentioned something about the Strategic Projects Review 2. Could you just explain what that is? Is this in the national document? Right, Mr. Turner.
So Transport Scotland are currently taking forward two kind of key pieces of national policy and project work, one being the National Transport Strategy, which has been in discussion for a while and likely to go into consultation over the summer in terms of the draft National Transport Strategy, which will effectively set the policies for what we expect from Scotland's transport system over the next 20 years, set the vision for that, set how it interacts with a whole range of other policies, etc. So that's coming out soon. Running slightly beside that, behind it to some extent, is the Strategic Transport Projects Review, so that's SDP-R, or this time round SDP-R2. And that will take the effectively objectives which are set by the National Transport Strategy, and try to understand at a national level what that might mean in terms of interventions. So that could be policy, that could be projects, it could be a whole range of things that we would have to do effectively to deliver the outcomes that are expected through the National Transport Strategy. So we are working in a number of different streams on producing that work at the moment, and some of it's through existing work that's ongoing, as Paul just set out, the strategic transport appraisal work, which is undertaken through the Aberdeen City Region deal, will effectively form a very key part of the evidence base for the north east of Scotland as part of the STPR process. We are looking national as well at kind of key routes, connections, etc., and working regionally throughout the country to just understand what the different objectives, the different outcomes might look like around the country. So that's ongoing at the moment. And the target for that is to publish within the current Scottish Parliament, so late 2020, early 2021, would be the publication of STPR2 effectively. Also keen to obviously, now that the planning bill is through the process, align STPR2 with the next version of the National Planning Framework, and work will be ongoing from now effectively to see where we can get on that alignment process.
Thank you, Mr. Torrance. Right, what I've taken from this is that there are a range of ongoing investigations and appraisal work in terms of transport in the northeast. Two things to take out. There's one, so there's a definitive delivery programme for a new road to Aberdeen Southern Harbour, £7 million investment. Yeah. The second part of the city deal is you talked about investigating the impacts of economic growth, what the development plans would bring, what the growth corridors would bring. So is there any money within that? Because we're talking about a substantial amount of money in the city deal, over 500 million, I think, is quoted in the proposed plan. So does that second part actually deliver any projects, or is it all about investigating?
The way that the city region deal is set up is that it is that £7 million is not for delivery. That is for getting schemes through the appraisal and probably to what we might call an oven-ready state through business cases for those who are those schemes which are identified collectively as having strong business cases, being deliverable, being feasible, being effective, and having wider political support. The current city region deal does not go beyond that. We have a 10-year city region deal, which is unlike the majority of other city region deals within Scotland, and most of them go on for about 20 years or thereabouts. I understand at the time that there were discussions at a political level, including, well, where do we go from the strategic transport appraisal going forward, because it would seem slightly odd to collectively invest all this money and effort, and £7 million is a considerable amount of time, in order to get schemes oven ready if there were not to be some form of cooking afterwards, so we could enjoy the meal. And again, I look at what's happening at Boulders at the moment, where they've just been given £10 million with the, look at extension of rail schemes there. Again, looking at that anticipation of what comes after that £10 million. Now, I'm aware that there hasn't been a political statement or anything at that stage, but one would have the anticipation that it would be a strange set of affairs if at the end of the regional transport, of the work we did in the regional transport strategy, the city region deal and the STPR work, you just heard of the amount of appraisal work that is ongoing, that some form of ability to move to the next stage of delivery was not able to be collectively worked through.
For my purposes today, because I'm looking at transport interventions that are set out in this proposed plan and the delivery, so paragraph, there's 3.6 in the plan, our spatial strategy, talks about the city region deal is valued to be £826.2 million over the next 10 years, and then goes on to say that UK and Scottish governments have invested £250 million in the city region, supported by a further 44 million from Aberdeen City Council, Aberdeenshire City Council and regional partners. And in addition, the Scottish Government have committed 254 million, which appears to only be for, well, not only, but for affordable housing delivery and broadband, as well as transport connectivity. Now, what I'm trying to understand is, does any of this money commit to delivering any of the transport interventions that are set out in Schedule 1 of the proposed plan?
I talked about the two schemes that are within the city region deal. I talked about the money for the Harbour Road and the strategic transport appraisal. At the same time as the city region deal was announced, Transport Scotland announced additional funding alongside the city region deal, amounting to £254 million. £200 million of that was earmarked for rail upgrades between Aberdeen and the Central Belt. £24 million of that money was allocated at that point to Lawrence Kirk Junction upgrades on the A90 South. So that, at the time of the announcement, was the commitment that the Minister Keith Brown gave to the local partners. So that was alongside the city region deal. And again, so that gives you an allocation of the funding ambition for the region that was announced by the Scottish Government at that point in time.
That's helpful, thank you. Right, before we move on to item 4, any further comments? Yes?
I think that, the difference between the 2014 plan and this one is effectively there's no strategic transport fund. And while that's regrettable, I think we can safely say that a good number of projects still continue to be delivered. Such as Kintour Railway Station was delivered, and following the previous examination that was asked to be put into the SDF. The SDF was always just a top slice. It was a top slice that pooled resources for strategic schemes. The massive work that actually comes through the regular day-to-day developer contributions, working with SESTRAN, working with the transport authorities. If I could just backcast to the Transport Scotland received an objection to the AWPR in 2008. And Transport Scotland, in response to the objection, because the objection was very much this is additional capacity, why aren't we looking at a more multimodal approach? The AWPR is part of the modern transport system that includes investment in park and ride, rail, bus priority measures, commuter plans. The MTS was developed by Mestrans. It has been through review. There are a range of projects in there that are reflected in the projects that are within the Strategic Development Plan, both in 2014 as well as today. And it includes local rail, cross rail. It includes strategic rail, rail freight, airport access, ports maritime, cycling, walking, safety. All these things come forward without necessarily saying, where have you identified the funding? Because we've been doing it for years and will continue to do it. And there are various pots of money available from Transport Scotland as the often very competitive pots of money to enable additional more multimodal approaches to be brought forward and behavioural approaches. The STF was the top slice. It wasn't the whole pot. And through developer contributions, the local schemes such as walking, cycling, as well as even travel plans, if it's a significant development with a traffic generator, there are things that are happening and continue to happen. Even when they were identified for the STF, they still happen. So the key difference between the 2014 and today seems to be we don't have an STF, but we still have all the other options available and that we employ. It's also worth considering that the regional transport strategies are asked to be ambitious, and that's set down in the Act 2006, I think. But they're also asked to be affordable and credible, and that's where we're still seeking to deliver that MTS that was associated with the AWPR. So the STS was only a top slice, and the fact that we don't have the STF anymore is regrettable, in that it offered an additional way of meeting pinch points in the network, but it doesn't remove the whole package of money available to deliver transport schemes.
We're going to come on in the next few items, particularly item 6, to look at deliverability and how we deliver and the wording of the 2014 plan compared to the proposed plan in terms of certainty to developers and what they have to provide to implement transport interventions that are in Schedule 1. Anything else on item 3 before I move on to item 4? No. Okay. So item 4 is Transport Scotland's involvement in the process and clarification of its concerns raised in response to the proposed plan. So firstly, Mr. Torrance, could you just explain your involvement in this particular cumulative transport appraisal process?
I think start maybe just slightly before that, because obviously as we've just heard that the previous work has been important and has informed all the cumulative transport appraisal updates effectively that have been taking place recently. So Transport Scotland, through working with the councils, we have been reviewing the scope of some of those services, providing comments at various stages throughout those formulation of work packages effectively. We will then review the outputs from those at various stages. We've only just received obviously the latest version of the cumulative transport, the options, kind of packaging, etc. So we're going through that review at the moment. But essentially we have been at the table as these things have been developed over the last number of years. And so that's why we're still in a position where we're happy with the process. We're reasonably comfortable with the robust and credible statements that we've made before. These models, this information effectively forms the evidence base for a lot of work that we're doing in that region as well. So the technical side of it, I think we've been relatively comfortable with and fairly well involved with as we go through it. If we move on to the concerns then that we have, it's about how the outputs from that process have been used to inform the plan. Essentially, what we look at this stage of the proposed plan process is, does the proposed plan meet with the requirements of SPP and therefore the DPM tag that's referenced within SPP. Taking on board all the comments that DPM tag gives guidance, it's based on suggested timescales. There's all sorts of if buts and maybes that can be kind of woven into how that's taken forward as a proportionate approach to the plan at that stage. What essentially we're looking for is, does the land use strategy that is set out in the plan require transport interventions, strategic transport interventions when we're talking about strategic development plans, so particularly cumulative impacts, cross-boundary impacts, particular interventions where you would expect to see a number of development or areas of development contributing towards the solution. Are those set out in the plan, and is there a clear means of delivery to put that in place if the plan needs it? Unfortunately, I think in the way that Schedule 1 in particular is set out, there is a long list of interventions, potential interventions, which are at a certain stage of development, which may be required to support the plan. And that gives us a concern that essentially we don't really know what is absolutely required to deliver the level of development that's set out in the plan, and that's essentially what the representation is based on at this stage. Accepting that there is work ongoing, or to refine those to understand what that might be in future. At the stage the plan is published, it's not a clear clear list of interventions which are appraised to a certain stage, which then have a means to deliver them.
I mean, we're talking about a couple of words here, the word potential and the word maybe required is a concern. And the 2014 plan doesn't say that. It seems very definitive in terms of what is required. So that appears to be your concern. Is it the concern that a developer might, say, look, it says might be required and try and get out of making a contribution? Or is it that, we're going to come on to how they might be delivered in the future, but what is your concern down the line in terms of implementation of these transport interventions?
So the concern then about the potential and the may be required, if you look at the list, it is a long list. It's a very expensive list. I suppose if you started talking all of that up, a lot of the items on that list will not be easy to deliver. So the concern would be, if the plan does require all of those interventions, how would they be delivered? There's a list of 4 potential train stations within that list there. Does the plan require 4 potential train stations to be in place for that level of development? That takes a lot of work to get to the stage where Transport Scotland ministers, Network Rail would be able to commit to delivering any of those 4 stations. If we are saying that they are all required for the plan, is there a risk that 1, 2, 4 of them might not be delivered? And is that a risk for the plan? And similarly for some of the longer term road junction aspirations, are they all required? And if so, how do we get to a position where we understand what is required when? And how does that impact the actual spatial strategy and the delivery of housing, which is essentially what the plan is looking to do?
So we're jumping around a wee bit in the agenda. I think it's probably worth picking this up. So Mr. Torrance has raised 2 specific issues. And that's what the cumulative transport appraisal looked at, was potential interventions, not definitive ones. So Mr. Walsh, any comment?
Yeah, we said may be required on potential interventions because we're in a different context to the 2014 plan. The 2014 plan, while it said it was definitive that it was going to bring forward a strategic transportation fund, it could bring that through and examine those interventions in greater detail. But I would also caveat that with, if you read the STF guidelines, if you go to paragraph 5.1, it says that those interventions will still have to undergo staggered appraisals. So if they still needed to go through a further level of appraisal to see if they were actually necessary and justifiable and warranted. We're in a different situation. I think what we have is major allocations from the 2009 structure plan and major allocations from the 2014 structure plan that have got permissions. And I understand that we're all maybe to a degree slightly wounded because those permissions were on the basis of a strategic transport fund that we thought would help deliver that level of development. But it's quashed now, it's gone. Those permissions are still live, they're out there, those developments are going to come forward and they're not required to pay that extra level of obligation. However, they are still required to pay substantial obligations to the transport network. Not for those strategic transport interventions, but to the transport network. So they are still required to contribute to develop obligations. What is in the proposed plan, and to pick up on Dave's point there about housing, is it's a different level of housing and it's a different type of housing. Previously, what happened was housing numbers were set on a corridor basis. Therefore, local development plans had to find sites in those corridors. Whether they were maybe the best locations, they did have to find those sites. So sites have been allocated and maybe those sites haven't come forward. So they haven't been delivered, maybe for market reasons, for economic reasons, or maybe because of where they were. What we have done this time is we've removed that requirement, where we still say that the locations or allocations from LDPs must be within strategic growth areas, we've allowed it up to the best judgment of the local development plan teams to pick sites that they think are the most deliverable and most likely to come forward. They've gone through a fairly rigorous assessments. They wouldn't be preferred bid sites if they hadn't been assessed by our transportation colleagues at Aberdeen City and Aberdeen Shire. Scale of them is different. What we've proposed in this plan are, I'm going to rob a term from Paul there, oven-ready sites, which are smaller, which would have less strategic infrastructure needed to bring them forward, because our larger sites are having difficulties coming forward because maybe they're maybe it's economic reasons, maybe it's market reasons, or maybe because they're encumbered with the level of infrastructure required to bring them forward. So the sites in this plan, as in the allocations that are, the allowances that are proposed in this plan, it is noted in the plan in the Our Communities chapter that they should be of a smaller scale. So they're not major strategic allocations of what we had in the past. So in terms of delivery, we would feel that those sites are more deliverable. If you compare them to what we had, say the larger strategic sites, they obviously received permission on the basis that this level of infrastructure was necessary, but we can't really do anything retrospectively about that. There's no mechanism for us to go back and look for developer obligations for something that already has permission. Decision notices are done, Section 75s are signed, so there's nothing we can do about that. We obviously have a requirement under SPP paragraph 116 and 117 to look at housing supply target on a housing land requirement that is informed by a HNDA. So we're duty bound by that. So if the housing number is the housing number, then we have to go forward with that. And we look in terms of what infrastructure constraints are out there and what we need to consider in terms of what's realistically deliverable, and that's why we've changed tack and we've gone for sites of a maybe a more deliverable nature to compare with Jim. But I understand Transport Scotland's concerns in that they would have been supportive for previous large scale developments on the basis of the STF, but that's not there, and we don't have the ability to bring forward supplementary guidance, obviously, for other reasons of what's happened with the planning bill. That's not going to happen. There is, part of the planning bill says there's going to be an infrastructure levy coming forward, but that's going to take time to come through. So it's not right and proper for us to put something like that in the plan to say we'll try and take forward something like that if we don't know if we're going to have the mechanisms to be able to do that. So that's why we've, yeah.
So, I mean, thank you for that. But I think the key point here that Mr. Torrance has made, and he gave two examples, and it'd be useful you could refer to those two examples. But what I need to understand, okay, so you've moved from strategic allocations to smaller oven-ready sites that could be implementable. As I understand it, the cumulative transport appraisal still says there'll be an impact. It doesn't matter if they're small sites or strategic sites, you've still got the same population demographic changes, the same number of housing, the same amount of employment. So there's still going to be impacts on the transport network. And the proposed plan sets out potential or maybe required transport interventions. Mr. Torrance has asked, are they required? What happens if they are not implemented to your spatial strategy? And what I'd like to do in a minute, you can answer that, and then what I'd like to do is let's look at the wording of the extant plan and the current plan, the proposed plan, and see what the differences are and whether or not there's certainty that a developer would have to contribute. You're saying that you're concentrating contributions to implement this. So firstly, if you go back to Mr. Torrance's examples and explain in terms of the spatial strategy, are these interventions required or not?
Well, I know you gave the specific example of the train stations, so I might hand that over to Jeff for a moment.
So, within the reporting provides the evidence base for decision makers to make a decision on what schemes are worthwhile and what not to go forward. It doesn't come to a conclusion on the actual schemes involved across the process. It's an evidence base for decision makers. But within the actual reporting and the impact appraisal, the particular issue with the train stations were put forward as an option not specifically to deal with capacity issues on the rail lines in terms of seating capacity and so on, but to encourage modal shift away from the private car and reduce some of the impacts across the network. So the key requirement of the first objective of the plan was to reduce the congestion from the level of traffic generated. It was the rail station objective was to encourage modal shift and to increase growth on the railways, which to some extent it had some very positive impacts in terms of in terms of providing better accessibility for public transport and providing an alternative. But it wasn't a core. They aren't a core scheme for reducing traffic congestion. The evidence didn't show that. For example, but for some of the other schemes, particularly in Package 1, there are more essential requirements. Some of the junctions, for example, there's a lot of conflicting traffic movements, and, for example, managing those movements through traffic signals at particular junctions would provide, would alleviate some of the congestions and provide a better level of service. In general, not providing some of these or not all of these particular schemes would effectively we'd be accepting a lower level of service across the network in terms of travelling in and around the north east of Scotland.
So essentially what you're saying is some, not all, of these packages could be implemented. If they're not implemented, the outcome is that we have a lower level of service, possibly more congestion, junctions which are congested up. Is that the outcome? So there's going to be more impact on the road network if these are not implemented along with the spatial strategy that's being envisaged.
Yes, effectively, that would be the case.
Ms. Anderson.
Just going to say that the package 2, the rail interventions, when we're looking to mitigate the plan, we've probably drawn on the regional transport strategy, which in its, I don't know which number that is, for it's the RTS refresh. It builds on the regional strategy for mesh strands approved in 2008, which again followed on from the modern transport system that you spoke about, that it had in our mesh strands voluntary days a cross-rail study, feasibility study that looked into rail, and it looked at various intermediate stations. It's always been part of the regional transport strategy. It couldn't be delivered on its own because there was some very big bits of infrastructure required about the Aberdeen area line constraints that meant we couldn't put it in as a package on its own. It wasn't value for money. But the mesh strands has always had the aim of incrementally building towards the cross-rail desire of new stations. It was in our original RTS that was approved by Minister, our 2013 refresh that came out, which was a result of the new strategic development plan at that time, the climate change, economic action plan that was out. We took the opportunity to refresh the RTS, and it went even further to speak about the rail connections. Contour was at that time becoming more of a committed scheme. We had funding towards it, which we thought was the Strategic Transport Fund. That's obviously fallen by the wayside. The Nationals still worked with our local authorities and received funding for Contour, and from government it's now been delivered. So the next stage within the refresh was to look at the other sites that we'd like to bring forward, and the 4 new rail stations are in RTS refresh that was signed off by Minister in 2013. So that is why they made their way into the option appraisal for the main issues report, because they are a strategy aim for mesh strands.
So a bit like Contour then, are you looking at other funding streams to implement these 4 stations?
As they're in our strategy, we will take them forward and develop them. We normally tend to use stag appraisal for elements of bringing forward the RTS. It could be that it's fed into the STPR2 or City Region deal if it falls out of the strategic transport appraisal as well. Mesh strands use our own funding to take forward feasibility studies and
possibly key here. So these are aspirations for Crossrail and 4 stations within the Regional Transport Strategy 2013. I think it's core document 76. So they're aspirational. They are not required in order to implement the spatial strategy. Am I picking that up right? That they've been picked up in the proposed plan simply because they've been signed off by Scottish ministers as part of the Regional Transport Strategy?
I think you say they're simply because they're in the regional transport strategy, and I have to take issue with that. We have a coherent spatial strategy, which is focused on focusing the development in the most accessible areas. 2 of the strategic corridors correspond with the rail lines. It is an overall government objective to reduce carbon dioxide emissions and to promote accessibility by sustainable modes. The rail system is a sustainable mode, and therefore if we can complement the spatial strategy by providing sustainable access points along the corridors, and they would also then, in terms of land use policy, act as nodes themselves. And I'm now looking at Inverurie rail station, where Aberdeenshire Council is looking to develop high-density office building. And then we look at feeding people sustainably into Aberdeen, which we have aspirations to be a high-growth, attractive area for employment, leisure, as part of the city centre master plan. There is a fundamental logic between transport planning and the spatial strategy, which actually goes beyond trying to model congestions at junctions as arise there. So that is a fundamental, bigger than point that goes beyond the cumulative transport appraisal, surely because we are all in the business of promoting sustainable development within the North East of Scotland, and there is a fundamental case, regardless of what the model says, for actually building upon the sort of society that we wish to see in terms of a positive point, instead of always being on the back foot trying to build our way out of trouble, forever adding new lanes onto signalised junctions. But I do know that the modelling that Jeff did in terms of the cumulative appraisal was supportive of the concept of the rail stations. Now, 4 rail stations have been listed there. I'm pleased to say that Nestrand and partners continue to investigate beyond the point of this plan being published, the most appropriate number and strategy of rail stations. I'm pleased to say that we've submitted a bid the other day to the Transport Scotland's own funding stream in terms of feasibility for these stations. So I think you have to understand that the pipeline approach that we have to take in terms of bringing schemes forward, and whereas we are often not delivering certainty, often we are reducing uncertainty as we go through the appraisal. But we have to realise the importance of the strategic development plan and the regional transport strategy in enabling that ability to form the narrative for the strategic cases that we're making.
It's probably just worth adding to that of what's not in there, and that through the option sifting exercise, some of the more maybe aspirational or ambitious schemes in terms of new rail lines were sifted out as in terms of the deliverability context to the option sifting exercise. So it was only the rail stations that came forward in terms of the rail network, and also rail station car parking. Some of the larger schemes, the more ambitious, maybe less deliverable, were sifted out at the option sifting stage.
Yes, I mean, I think what has changed substantially is the carbon agenda and the need for reduced emissions. The regional transport strategy refresh, it promoted a multimodal approach, and following the delivery of the AWPR, it has given an opportunity to lock in some of these benefits that are associated with the modern transport system, which has been this aspiration, a well-founded, well-informed aspiration for the region since the voluntary days prior to statutory regional transport partnership. These aspirations have been referred to by Transport Scotland in terms of objections to do with the AWPR. The opportunity there is that the RTS promotes a package approach that's in line with SPP 270, that the planning system should optimise the use of existing infrastructure, reduce the need to travel, provide safe and convenient opportunities for walking, cycling, active travel and recreation, enable the integration of transport modes and facilitate freight movement by rail and water. I would also go on to say that government, in bringing forward the planning review, commissioned research that was planning for infrastructure research project, final report 2015. And I'll just do a quick reference there. The rest...
I'll just stop you there, I think.
Could I just say that, because it is actually quite important in terms of this relative, the junctions versus the train stations. The risk of transport planning is that the drive to deliver road infrastructure as big-ticket items loses the necessary focus on public transport, cycle routes and parking, walking connections and wayfinding. It went on to state that most consultees equated transport with new and upgraded roads rather than considering the transport hierarchy of walking, cycling, public transport and then final roads. So what we are proposing is that we're going to get onto that additional local that has been delivered, but will continue to be delivered through the conventional systems. And hopefully by the time that an infrastructure levy comes in, if there's any other big ticket items, then we will have those identified at that point in time, and there might be other funding streams available. But the multimodal approach is what's being promoted, and it isn't it's how these things contribute to the removal of those pinch points within the networks.
We need to simplify this. There's no concern from Transport Scotland that the appraisal conducted has been flawed. I don't think there's any concern from Transport Scotland or another party that the strategy of moving away from the private car to other sustainable modes of transport, that's not being queried either. What is being queried is that there's a list in the proposed plan of potential transport interventions. Transport Scotland is concerned about, are they required? And if they are required, how are they going to be delivered? Now, I think what would be useful for me is to look at the current plan, the extant plan, and have a look at the wording of that. And this may be down to wording here. This could be down to semantics in terms of how is this written. So is it that the Schedule 1 is simply saying the cumulative transport appraisal gave out potential transport interventions, but we actually require them, and these are the ones we require? Or are you saying these are potential, they need further investigation down the line? Or are you saying they're just potential, and if they happen, that's great, and if they don't, it doesn't matter? That's what I'm trying to understand. So could you look at the extant SDP? And let's have a look. I think it's Section 5, putting this plan into practice, talks about infrastructure, and Schedule 2, the proposals. Mr. Walsh, could you just explain to me what this says in terms of the promotion of infrastructure?
Apologies. Thank you, Director. I think, okay, what it makes a nod to, or what it acknowledges, is that the level of development that is proposed in this plan, which is carried forward from the 2009 structure plan, requires a greater level of infrastructure investment. And it says that developers need to accept that this infrastructure will be necessary, and that the Strategic Development Planning Authority would take forward and prepare supplementary planning guidance in support of this plan. So I suppose what you could say is that this plan has a caveat on it, and that it will be only complete when the Strategic Transport Fund supplementary guidance has been adopted. Okay, so we don't have that caveat in this plan, but I suppose it places quite heavy weight on the fact that this plan would be able to go forward on the supplementary planning guidance being approved, and as we all know, it was appealed and it was quashed. So whatever monies have been collected cannot be used for those interventions. Now, what I would also say is in the supplementary guidance itself, it does say that those interventions which are listed in it will need further assessments to go forward. I think Sheena said earlier on that it's based on, I suppose, the worst case scenario. We might say the best case scenario in terms of like growth for the region, and that if every site was built and every allocated site came forward, and that's including flexibility or under the old terminology and generosity in the current terminology, this is what we would need to do. And it also says, when we get on to the next page, that there'll be monitoring and review of the plan. So, while I suppose it's not explicitly stating it, but those interventions that would come forward would be looked at and commenced as and when we felt that they were necessary, as and when we felt there was an impact on the transportation network. So there needed to be future studies to actually inform when that was required, when we would need to kick off on these projects. So, sorry.
Tom, I'll just say, look, I'm just reading here 511, which is the crux, I think, if you look at the first sentence of 511. A range of projects have been proposed that will help us. They've been proposed and they will help us achieve our vision for the North East. Okay? While some are well underway, others are at an early stage. They may help us achieve our vision. They are proposed. These are set out in the spatial strategy as well as being listed in Schedule 2. Now, I look at that paragraph and I contrast that with the wording we have on top of Schedule 1 in the current plan, and I think you'd probably need some sort of grammatical degree to start trying to weasel out between the differences here. I think the intent and the wording of what's said in the previous plan, we have a range of proposals. Some of these are at early stage. Some of them are well underway. I then look at those list of plans in Schedule 2, and I'm thinking, yep, they all seem sensible. There's an ambitious list of schemes here, many of which might add up to millions of pounds. I'm wondering now how some of these might be delivered. I'm not too sure. Well, I do know actually, but if I was someone there, and again, I then contrast that with Schedule 1. I see a far less ambitious list of schemes here, again according with the Regional Transport Strategy, according with the cumulative transport appraisal work that we have done. I'm looking here, it summarises the transport interventions identified by a cumulative transport appraisal. I think that's even more specific than we had last time, which is actually showing the provenance of where we're coming from that may be required. These are proposals to help us achieve our vision. I think I've made my point.
Still don't think we've got down to the nub, the crux of where I'm coming from, which is I'm still not certain here if these projects listed in Schedule 1 are required or not. And I'll take you through the extent plan. So when we're looking at Chapter 5, Section 5, there are statements, we must invest in existing and new infrastructure in the Strategic Development Plan area. So it's definitive, we must invest. We must also need to invest in facilities and services for communities, so you must invest. Paragraph 5.8, developers will have to accept the need for contributions toward necessary infrastructure. Paragraph 5.9, transport projects which are needed as a result of the combined effect of new development will be funded and delivered. So again, to me, that reads quite definitively. And then when we looked at Schedule 2 proposals, there isn't potential here. Each of them are listed definitively. You'll invest in port facilities. You will provide road investment at junctions. So it's quite definitive that this is required. And when we look back, yes, the Strategic Transport Fund is an element of funding some of that, but paragraph 5.8 appears to suggest that contributions necessary for infrastructure will also be required, and seems to tie into what the list that's required at the end. Whereas if we look at the proposed plan, it's talking about potential interventions that might be required. And when we look at the text in the plan, paragraph 3.7 of the proposed plan, to meet changes of the scale of this plan, we must invest in existing and new infrastructure, and the City Region Deal investment will help us deliver a number of key packages. And we've already talked about what the City Deal will deliver or not. This will be essential to maintaining and enhancing the quality of life for communities. Developers will also have to accept the need for contributions for necessary infrastructure. So there's the parallel to paragraph 5.8 in the extant plan, services and facilities. But there's no tie-in there, no mention of Schedule 1 for transport infrastructure. So it's not clear perhaps there that they may have to provide some of these projects. Is it a case of, it's just questioning here, I'm just trying to understand, and you can help me here. Are these required? And is it just the wording here that we're getting hepped onto? And Mr. Torrance, you can help as well in a second.
I think the key issue here is that the planning system seeks to achieve multiple outcomes, as does the regional transport strategy. There's multiple objectives in there in terms of modal shift, in terms of reduction of carbon. It's not all about growth, and it's not all tied to growth. There's also the change in the transport agenda means there's different transport options have to be offered in order to allow behavioural change as well as less carbon. So it isn't just about growth, it's about changing the way cities function and how people use cities, and that's in the city centre master plan. All the schemes to say, do these schemes, are they necessary to deliver growth? It's not just about growth. Are they necessary just to deliver the emissions outcome? No, it's not just about the emissions. There's multiple objectives that the planning system seeks to achieve. It seeks to complement and work with partner agencies, as well as implement government policy in terms of the longer term. This is a long-term plan. So to kind of move everything around the growth agenda is the planning actually has to meet multiple outcomes, and sometimes they're conflicting multiple outcomes. And I would say that the issue of funding here, I mean, the planning review looked at the issue of funding, and the members of that review said, the issue of financing significant pieces of infrastructure has not been resolved and was again raised as an issue through the planning review. And it concluded that linking infrastructure with plan development is the most significant challenge for the planning system at this time. The solutions to this challenge extend well beyond the planning system. It's a complex area. Infrastructure funding depends on both public and private sector contributions. So when we talk about investment, it's public investment, levering private investment, or it might a balance between the two. It might be government investment to move us in a different policy direction. So I think it is complicated, but to itemise and say that serves that and we'll get money from that is we wouldn't be planning for very much if we were to say that we had to itemise and cost every item that came through a 20-year plan.
Mr. Torrance, sorry, I'll come back to yourself again. So your concern is to do with particularly the wording of Schedule 1. Is that correct?
I think that's part of it, yes. Part of it is also probably the stage that the appraisal was at when this version of the plan was published. Obviously we're now getting more detail through the local transport appraisals about sifting these options down, starting to package them. But it goes back to that question of, for this spatial strategy, what are the key bits of strategic infrastructure or policies or whatever other intervention you have to make in the transport system? What does it need, potentially even in the shorter to medium term? And then what are the other things that we need to work on which would be nice to have or would help or would fit with wider policy? And it's about how that could have or should have been set out in the plan. At the moment, I think the concern is that there's a long list of things there which we're not quite sure as to whether we need them or not to deliver that spatial strategy.
I was going to ask this later, but I think it's useful if we look at it now. So when I look at the proposed plan, and let's take, for example, page 13, so the strategic growth area for Aberdeen City, there seem to be quite definitive markers on the figure 2 there, spatially showing movement, intervention. So there's the Pursley Bridge Parkway, Kings Wells, A96 dualling, and then in terms of connection, there are connections shown, improved cross-city connections for active travel, improved cross-boundary connections for active travel green networks. Are these definitive transport interventions that are required in order to implement your spatial strategy?
So the it's all numbers 1 to 7, yeah, okay. Some of those have come through from the previous CTA, so they've been carried forward, and they're in other documents and strategies as well. So Percy Bridge Parkway came from the SDF, was carried forward, and there are developer obligations set aside from that from Granham, so there's money captured for that. Intervention at King's, Ken might have to speak more specifically for some of these, but yeah.
I'm not particularly interested in where they came from or what they are, but they appear to be very definitive because they're
required, dependent on the level of delivery over time. So if you look at the SDF, it's predicated on a certain amount of delivery over time. So as of when that comes forward, then there's triggers, or there were triggers in Section 75 agreements that contributions will be made towards these. So it's tied towards development. So current rates of delivery would take a long time before those would be required. And what's in the CTA maybe looks at that level of delivery a lot more rapidly than what we're actually seeing at the moment. So, but can I also just caveat that in that, we would be doing future studies post AWPR to see how the network is working, and the AWPR and other pieces of infrastructure that are coming forward in terms of rail services and bus services, or demand management and behavioural change may negate that. So it's a question of how quickly development comes forward, and it's a 20-year plan. So it could take. I'll give you an example. Say Chapelton of Elsick is a huge allocation, and the rate of development that we expected on that we thought would be deliver a lot more quickly, but it's less than 300 houses out of an allocation of 4,000, and it's going quite slowly. Same with Granham, it's an allocation of I think 7,000, and that's going quite slowly as well. So the 2010 CTA and the current version, they look at what would happen if things were built out and if things are built out at quite a rapid rate. And I suppose the economic data that, I'm sorry, I'm going back into the modelling, I'll get through as quickly as possible here, but the economic data that that would have gone into the SL model was probably from a more optimistic period of time. It would have been before the drop in oil price, so we would have thought that we would have seen things would have come forward a lot more quickly. So yes, they are necessary, but they're necessary on how quickly development comes forward. And then there may be other future studies or programs that come in that tell us, well, actually, you know what, they may not be necessary now. So.
Yes, can I just agree with that? They were identified as required at the time the studies were carried out. And Tom's right, some of them may be quite far into the future before they're required, but they are required at some point. But things change. That's based on a forecast, so they would be subject to review sometime in the future. But at the time the studies were carried out, they were identified as required.
So we're getting somewhere now. So what you've spatially shown on these diagrams is required at the present time. I understand that subject to review, and there's stagger appraisal and other appraisals that would go on, behavioural change may occur, build-out rates may slow. So at the point at which they're required may change as well. So I understand that. So which of these movement and connections, are these all shown within Schedule 1? Is that where the tie-in is?
To differentiate, I might get Jeff to come in for a second. Some of them are from CTA recommendations 2010, and some of them are from the current CTA. So.
I would just say, sorry, yes, they are, because we look at Schedule 1 and we look at elements such as here's a range of active travel infrastructure initiatives improving accessibility, and they will link to the active travel connections, both cross-city connections of active travel and the within the city interventions within there. So there is this packaged approach that has been taken, and the diagrams provide a spatial expression of where those packages or elements of those packages would be focusing. And I'm looking here at the cycle lane between Kingswells and West Hill, one I'm very familiar with. We've got cross-boundary work here, looking on the A96 corridor and the A90 South, again, work that I'm very familiar with people in our team, working with Ken's team, taking it forward. I think the Fort Martin and Buckham Way here is reference work we've undertaken with Sustrans. And indeed, I think to support the spatial strategy, all these elements have got a compelling narrative regarding, and that compelling narrative is linked to the spatial strategy in terms of the linking along the strategic corridors and feeding into the city. The question is, at what point and at what rate of development will they become essential? I would suggest that quite a lot of these, we don't know that because we don't know the rate of build-out. However, they will always make a positive contribution to achieving the modal shift objectives, which we were talking about earlier in terms of that wider planning goal that we wish to see. So if you're saying, this is the difficulty here, if we're doing a transport assessment of a development and trying to work out the 85th percentile, which place the junction goes, yes, you could probably work that out, but I don't actually think that's the right question. I think in terms of the broader strategy of supporting where we want to go, these have a compelling narrative, and they should be the sorts of initiatives that we should be seeking to encourage development to contribute towards if we want to achieve the economic development goals of the region, which is sustainable, high-quality life for our residents. So I think we can point to every single one of those arrows and link that back to a study, and I think we could also then link that back to some of the phraseology that we have here in Schedule 1 as well, because of some of the wording has been packages, a range of active travel change initiatives going forward. And I'm looking at some of the other interventions here. We're talking about the A956. Again, we've just commenced a Stag 2 study on that. We're linking that in with the route to the harbour. the Bridge of Bree Stag has been taken forward. That's taken to two. So, yeah, I'm looking at this list here in terms of movement. I'm confident of the work that has been done or will be done, because we believe, such as on the A944, the AWPR has introduced some issues there that we're aware of. Again, the actual intervention, probably we're not too sure at the moment, because we need to do the work on what happens if the AWPR opens and things like that. So in terms of requirement and compelling narrative, yes. In terms of timing, development rate, there's a question there as well. And again, sometimes of these in the wording in Schedule 1, there is a vagueness, and that vagueness, as we had the vagueness in the last time, accepting that further work has to be done. And I would probably say the rail stations fall into that category. Further work has to be done. We might wish there might be a requirement for 4 stations. However, when we get the rail engineers out there, which we probably won't do for a while yet, they might say, well, the curve on that track's a bit too challenging, it's not feasible. So that's the reality of where we are, I would suggest.
Mr. Torrance, any comment in terms of what you've heard there?
I think I would agree with the point that were made that there's always going to be further work that is required to be done to schemes that are identified, especially at strategic development plan stage. The key here is to identify, as I said earlier, those cumulative cross-boundary interventions which are required by this particular land use strategy, and to have a clear way of working through whatever work, whatever further study, whatever delivery mechanisms you have to go through to deliver those over time, and that's what we're looking for when we look at strategic development plans.
And I think that's probably where Jeff's modelling work comes in terms of the 3 packages that has been modelled on these interventions. The first package, Package 1, I think Jeff would agree, is a package of relatively low-cost practical interventions at a number of junctions, which probably could be worked through with developer contributions, help from Nestrans and the capital funding processes that we have in place. We have a Package 2, which looks to implement the rail station, so that Network Rail have set up a pipeline process, and we need to work through that process. However, as one of only 2 people in 2 places in Scotland that have actually taken through a rail station through the Scottish Stations Fund, we know that it can be done in terms of Kintor. And then we look at the level 3 interventions, which I think probably reflect the more higher end of development levels that come out. And again, that is possibly where it's more challenging, but we believe that there is a process taking forward on that one. Jeff, do you want to just elaborate perhaps on those 3 packages more?
I don't think that's necessary. I think we're honing in here. So what I'm taking now is that actually what's in Schedule 1 is shown in the figures, and it is required as part of your spatial strategy. Now, I understand that there's a stage process here. So at the minute, you're saying that these proposals have potential to provide the benefits that you would like to see, and there's 3 packages that would do that. But they require further appraisal or investigation down the line. And we're going to come on under the next agenda item to look at what SPP and the DPM tag says about that, in terms of whether you can stage this in that manner. But from Transport Scotland's point of view, and I'll ask the authority about this as well, if the wording was changed in Schedule 1 to make it clear that actually these are required, subject to further appraisal investigation, would that be acceptable in terms of giving more certainty, to yourselves and to potential developers that might have to contribute toward them?
We'd always have to see what that wording was, but it would go some way towards addressing the concerns that we've set out in the representation. Quite how far we could get on agreeing wording for all of the interventions that are on that list there, I don't know, but the principle of further explanation, further understanding of where these particular ones sit and how they'll be taken forward, yes, I would agree that could give us some further comfort, but we'd have to see the wording.
Because my understanding from your mic amendment, thanks. My understanding from your proposed modification to the plan was to provide, it wasn't full stop here, handbrake on. It was provide additional explanation about what's happening here. And I'm talking about a global explanation, not for each intervention. So I think the problem arising here, because I've heard now that these are definitive, they are not necessarily required because of the build-out rates and whatever else, and we've heard the other potential, but they require further investigation down the line. But at present, they are required for the spatial strategy, subject to further appraisal down the line. So if we could come up with some kind of a wording, that might be acceptable to Transport Scotland.
Yes, subject to the wording. However, I would put a caveat on the specifics of the rail stations and the numbers that are mentioned there. As Paul just set out, as you go through that process, it might be 1, it might be 2, it might be 3, it might be 4 that you knock out through the process for a whole number of reasons. The plan states specifically 4 stations, and the question therefore would be, are 4 stations required, or is it that we just need to study the rail network and understand what the best means of improving that for the wider purposes of the region, but also to support the spatial strategy? So there may be some interventions, I think, that we would look to reword, whereas other interventions such as corridor improvements, particular junctions, we would be happy to say that yes, we can look at those corridors. But when we're mentioning specific numbers of stations, that is a step too far, I would suggest.
You've got to excuse me here. We're looking for certainty, and they've been this plan's certain. Well, not at the minute. It says potentially there's 4 stations, but it doesn't actually say where they are in the plan. It just says to north and south of Aberdeen rail station, north and south of Aberdeen. So it's not clear immediately where they are specifically. But is that not more certain than saying we need to review the rail network?
It is, but it could well be certainly wrong. If you're defining you need 4 stations for this spatial strategy, you might never get 4 stations. So suppose what I'm saying is it's just clarity around what that aspiration is. It is an aspiration, as we've talked about, set out through the regional transport strategy. It's an aspiration that will be looked at through the various studies that are going on, strategic transport appraisal, strategic transport projects review at a national level as well. They may well come out with a suggestion, they may well come out with a direction that says 1 station, or no stations, or 3 stations. The plan at the moment says it needs, if we're taking Schedule 1 as the requirements of the plan, it needs 4 stations.
Right. What I'm going to propose just now, it's 12:30. I think it'd be useful to take a break right now. I don't know how everyone's placed for getting home at the end of the day. Is there a particular time that people need to be away? No. Okay. Well, there are a range of options for lunch. Well, the range of options for lunch in the area are limited. I don't know if Ewan, if that was the van outside. Okay, that's yes. Well, we'll talk about options in a minute. But if I say if we break and come back at 1:30, and during that time, if you have a think about the wording of the plan, and then we can come back and usefully discuss that after lunch. Okay, so 1:30. Thank you. We can continue. I have a few questions arising from our discussion this morning, but before I proceed, any comments from any parties? No. Well, what we'll do, we'll come back to the wording in a minute. I'll ask a few questions, and then I think at the end we'll move on to item 5, and we can come back to any changes that may or may not be proposed at the end. Does that sound like a plan? Yeah. Okay, so in terms of item 5, the response from the authority with respect to Transport Scotland's concerns in relation to Scottish planning policy and the DP tag. So it's my understanding that the authority considers the transport appraisal should be proportionate and give a proportionate response determined by the level and scale of a plan. The proposed plan can only be appraised at a strategic scale, whereas the detail of feasibility and deliverability can be fully understood once sites are allocated and local development plans and investigated through a further transport appraisal at that level. Is that a correct understanding?
Yeah, that would be correct. Yeah.
And Transport Scotland, do you have no problem with that particular understanding?
I think we would say that there is a level of appraisal obviously that can be undertaken without having the specific sites, and it's whether that in balance, as we discussed earlier on, is proportionate for the plan at that stage. Does it give you an extra level of detail that you need, or in this case, could it have been done on the corridor basis with some of the allocations not tied down specifically?
Yeah. How did you know? I might just call on Jeff to explain the difference between the version of the CTA that supported the proposed plan and then what we did with the site-specific information from the main issues reports for the second part of the CTA.
Yes, so during the first part of the appraisal, where we looked at the general distributions of development, we produced some impact assessments to look at the emerging results of the plan, and that didn't go to the same detail as the second part of the appraisal, but it looked at transport impacts and rail impacts at that time. The updated information in terms of the detail and the site-specific information does allow you to model the impacts in more detail, and it provides better evidence-based when you're looking at transport proposals. So you've got a proportionate approach there, that you've got the detailed developments, and then you have the detail of a transport proposal. So it kind of is more balanced in terms of your inputs and your outputs from the process.
Okay, thank you. I think if we look at Scottish planning policy, and Mr. Torrance, it'd be good if you had a copy of this. Do you have a copy? Yes, brilliant. And if we look at the particular wording of paragraphs 274 and 275, it refers to development plans. So, Mr. Torrance, does that mean that they relate to the SDP and associated LDPs as one, rather than indicating that advice should be implemented at each stage?
I think paragraph 274 notes obviously the DPM tag guidance as well, which does give specific further advice on how strategic development plans should be appraised, and then subsequently local development plans within the strategic development plan area. So there is guidance there which differentiates between strategic development plans and local development plans, and therefore it's probably, from an appraisal point of view, correct to look at them separately. But I would agree that overall what we're looking for is for that flow between the strategic development plans, identifying strategic interventions for local development plans to kind of follow through on.
I don't think that's disputed about the flow, but I mean, we're specifically, without looking at, I realise it refers to the DPM tag, but looking at the wording of Scottish planning policy, it refers to development plans. Now, do you take that as it's indicating that the provisions of 274 and 275 apply singly when you're preparing a strategic development plan, and they also apply to local development plans, or is that a whole?
I would say that they apply singly.
Mr. Walsh, any comment? Or sorry, yeah.
Sorry.
Yes, I certainly would say that that's an interpretation that is. I think when SPP is written, it reflects a range of plans across a wide geography in Scotland, and it's worded in such a way that allows plans to come forward from ones that where there hasn't been one before, through to ones that are well established. And I think that very much reflects that the strategic can't, given that it's a 20-year plan, can't identify the level of detail. It would be inappropriate to identify a level of detail, particularly where it affected junction improvement, because you would never get anything into the system in terms of the objectives that the proposal is seeking to meet if you had to actually work through the detail at the start. You wouldn't do that. It would be a waste of money as well. So I think there has to be, and as Transport Scotland said at the 2014 plan, that the level of detail there was commensurate with the tier of the plan. So in 2014, Transport Scotland were quite happy to distinguish between the tiers of plan and plan making and the detail required in terms of appraisal.
So, Mr. Torrance, when I look through Scottish planning policy as a whole, I'll give you one example. So, paragraphs 98, for example, and to do with business locations. So that refers to strategic development plan should and provides an outline. Paragraph 99. Strategic development plans and local development plans out with SDPs should, so an allocation to those. And then below, development plans should, so again, something a bit different. And then scrolling further down, 101, local development plans should. So SPP here, and this isn't the only instance it does this, it's distinguishing between what strategic development plan should do, what local development plan should do, what local development plan outside an SDP area should do, and what development plans as a whole should do. Does that mean that there should be a distinction between the two? And if paragraphs 274 and 275 meant to refer to strategic development plans and local development plans separately, it would have been explicit about that.
I think 274, as I've said, refers to further guidance which Transport Scotland had a hand in developing, and within that guidance it is explicit that there is a separate requirement, a separate understanding of what a strategic development plan should appraise, and I accept that there is different levels of detail that you can get to in each of those appraisals, and therefore what is set out within a strategic development plan effectively should be strategic, what should be cumulative, should identify the cross-boundary issues, whereas local development plan could be down to the individual junctions, etc., that would be required to be improved for specific sites, for example.
So, from my point of view, trying to understand where you say that the SDP as proposed doesn't align with SPP, what particular part of these two paragraphs are you referring?
It's about that requirements that we spoke about earlier. Is there a requirement for some of the schemes which are set out within the plan, Schedule 1 in particular? Is the plan relying on those interventions, and if so, how would they be delivered? So it's not so much on the appraisal side of things. Again, it is more about the wording of what are the interventions required, how will they be delivered, rather than the process that the plan is undertaking up until now to start to define and shape what those are.
Any comment from the authority or the side table?
I suppose, 274 does reference DPM tag, but DPM tag was done in 2011, and I believe under the previous SPP, whereas this is a different version of SPP, and when we read it and it says development plans, we would consider it as a whole, because they're all intrinsically linked and one flows from the other. Sorry, and if we do go through 274, and I mean, just moving through it quickly, planning authority are expected to embrace the impact of the spatial strategy and reasonable alternatives on the transport network. I mean, we would feel we did that. We've had a CTA at various stages which has supported the main issue support and the proposed plan, and it did consider emerging impacts. I believe one of those emerging impacts we looked at was what would happen on the network, and the spatial strategy has continued. We did talk in the main issue support about looking at western expansion, and when we looked at western expansion, we realised that there were issues around the A944 and West Hills. So on the basis of that informed the spatial strategy that we would keep it the same, because we didn't think we should take that one forward. So we have considered that, and also the plan does reference that we are trying to protect the AWPR junctions by making sure that any future development comes through the development plan process so it's properly considered. So it's not per se a policy, but it does inform the development plans to consider, the local development plans to consider that.
Okay, I think really what we're looking at here is probably paragraph 275, where it says development plan should identify any required new transport infrastructure. So it should identify any required, and then further on should indicate how new infrastructure or services are delivered and phased, and how and by whom any developer contributions will be made. Now, I think earlier we seemed to be coming to an agreement that actually those projects listed in Schedule 1 were required at this stage. Is that correct?
Yeah, we agree that, and dependent on phasing and when the need arose.
Quickly, in relation to Scottish planning policy, the policy principles that are set out in 270, paragraph 270, identifies that planning systems should support patterns of development which optimise the use of existing infrastructure, reduce the need to travel, provide safe and convenient opportunities for walking and cycling for both active travel and recreation, and facilitate travel by public transport, enable the integration of transport modes and facilitate freight movement by rail. There are many proposals within the Schedule 1 that seek to deliver those policy outcomes, and that they're not based on timing. They're being sought now.
I don't think here Transport Scotland are querying the list of projects that are identified in Schedule 1.
Not particularly in terms of what are these projects and where they came from. We know a lot of the background to a lot of the studies that have suggested these projects in the past. It's how the plan has reflected them. And again, back to the point, does the plan need them? If so, how are they delivered? And when do they need to be in by? Is what we're expecting to see here.
Okay, I'm just going to move on slightly. There's a circular on development planning, Circular 6/2013. That refers to the need for strategic development plans to set clear parameters for subsequent local development plans to inform decisions about strategic infrastructure investment. Does that not indicate that strategic development plans should provide the parameters, but that local development plans should investigate the feasibility, funding, and deliverability? Any comments?
It could. Sorry, could you give me the specific paragraph in the circular? Oh, sorry. Okay, apologies. Yeah, it could. The SDP informs the LDPs. I suppose what we would say is that our strategic development plan is it's a strategy document as opposed to a policy document like some of the other STPs, and it's up to then the LDPs to kind of put the meat on the bone, as it were, by putting policies and supplementary guidance around that.
Looking at the plan, so do you think it does provide sufficient parameters and a clear indication for LDPs? I mean, if you look at Schedule 1 again, is it clear to a local development plan that actually you should safeguard land for all these projects, or you should ensure that they are assessed or implemented?
I think that there is a comment somewhere where that it may well be in this circular that you should provide sufficient information to guide, but not so much that it would actually limit in terms of the outcomes. So many of the proposals that have come, I think we do master planning differently now than we did, say, 10 years ago. There's active travel. The role of public transport plays a much higher part within how local development plans and that tier of planning would set out a site. So much of the detail is fleshed out at the local level, and the potential impacts and service availability will dictate how many people use that service. Whether or not they walk cycle will be dependent on whether or not there's available safe routes, whether or not it's children, it's proximity in terms of catchment areas. There's so much detail at the local level that impacts. We know how much the school run impacts on our transport networks. So how that's dealt with at the local level is very much will determine how it actually impacts. So I think it's not light touch, it's giving the strategic areas, and it's identifying key bits of infrastructure that should come forward. But whether or not we need to do a list and instruct local development plans to do it, I don't think that we're a small enough authority to actually have good working relationships with partners, and that includes local development plans. And the action programme lists schemes and the potential timing of those as well. We do identify in terms of how to meet the targets within the plan on page 45 that local development plans will safeguard land for transport proposals identified in local and regional strategies, transport strategies. So that allows for things to come forward from other parts, but it does make sure that the implementation of the strategic development plan closely links with other strategies, active travel plans, etc.
So thank you. You picked up on a couple of points there. One, you said the plan identifies the key bits of infrastructure to implement the spatial strategy. So that again, we're going back to these are not potential, these are required at this stage to implement the spatial strategy, albeit under review. You've mentioned the action programme. Let's have a quick look at that in a minute. But before you do, you also mentioned how to meet the targets. Now, it says, as you said, local development plans will safeguard land for transport proposals identified in the local and regional transport strategies. It doesn't say, and those listed in Schedule 1. I don't know if that's on purpose or not, or whether it would be useful, again, we'll come back to wording at the end, for that to mention that. It mentions regional transport strategies. I don't mean to go back to these 4 railway stations, but the 4 railway stations are in a regional transport strategy. So the SDP is informing LDPs that they must safeguard land for those 4 stations. So we're in a situation here where the SDP is informing LDPs of particular projects, but not all projects. Is that correct?
I think it would be reasonable to say that the tier of plan making is instructing local development plans to identify specific projects as in the schedule, but many of them are reflected within the wider policy framework, because active travel pops up at different parts through the plan in terms of the resources section. So that's one of these issues, that active travel and less formal means of travel are encouraged as well through the master planning exercises. So, but yes, you are right to say that we've referred to other strategies but haven't been explicit in saying all the transport interventions identified within Schedule 1, which include site-specific, include policy initiatives, isn't identified.
Yeah, I mean, I appreciate that some of these they're not site-specific. But on that, is that something you could think about inserting as an additional? Was that something, was it omitted on purpose, or?
I suppose while we say that those interventions are required to deliver the spatial strategy, it is a case of that they'll have to be informed by further studies, and that's why it does say that they will be informed by further studies when we talk about safeguarding of land. And I think it's bullet point 1. Bullet point 1 of meeting how to meet targets on page 45, where it says the Council will work with Nestrans to make sure that the implementation of the Strategic Development Plan closely links with regional transport strategies, the Active Travel Action Plan, and the implementation of local and active travel routes. So, again, it has to kind of go through that process. So, we've identified through them here they are required, and depending on further studies, we'll be able to take them forward that way, but it is all linked with other strategies and programs bringing them forward. Yeah.
Can I just make a quick point specifically on the rail side of things? SPP paragraph 277 refers specifically to when rail proposals should be referenced within a plan, and it's around reaching agreement with Transport Scotland and Network Rail before rail proposals are included in the development plan or planning application, and that even at that point there would be further technical work, feasibility work, etc., to be gone through before we could actually say that those stations or those lines, if it was lines, were feasible. So I think identifying specifically 4 stations and starting to consider safeguarding land is very premature in that context.
I didn't really think that we'd get hipped up on this particular point because it wasn't raised, but as part of the package of Schedule 1, it's important to investigate this a bit further. So in terms of the extent development plan, strategic development plan, does it identify these stations?
Yes, it does identify the stations. There is the issue in terms of while we're not certain in terms of the phasing of those proposals coming forward, because the railway's more complicated than the strategic road network. It's not a self-service approach. It's franchising, and it's rail paths, and it's limited capacity, and there's competition for paths within that network. But we very much look to the Regional Transport Partnership, along with transport authorities, to work in order to bring forward any proposals. But for a local development plan to not identify a site that would allow that to come in the longer term, because that's one of the problems with the rail line. You are limited in your potential locations because it's a line, it's a fixed line, whereas a road will move about. You have different options. So in order to identify stations that serve not just a growth population but the existing population, and achieve those multimodal outcomes, different modal, less carbon intensive outcomes, then I think the reality is if you don't identify the land, it will potentially not be feasible, or it will cost you a lot more because the land will get a different consent attached to it, and then that's the consent that will dictate the price for the station land. So in order to, I mean, it's interesting to see that Scottish Government also says in 277, paragraph 277 of the, is it the 277? Yeah, it is. That first line in 277, paragraph 277, is disused railway lines with a reasonable prospect of being reused as rail, tram, bus, rapid transit or active travel routes should be safeguarded in development plans. So it's that thing about reasonable prospect and the timing. And if you allow development to go on there, onto a site, that you remove that opportunity forever. So, and that's the difference between the road and the rail. We know it's more complicated. We know it takes longer to bring through a station. There's a variety of things, service patterns and all the rest of it. But you have to identify the land, and that's the reason it's important that local development plans identify it at the earliest opportunity.
I don't want to get too hepped up on this particular point, but you've said they are identified currently in the extant strategic development plan. Okay. Any comment on that, Mr. Torrance, before I move on? Okay. Let's look at the development planning management transport appraisal guidance. I only have two very, hopefully, straightforward questions on this. One, Mr. Torrance, this guidance here, that promotes a proportionate approach to undertaking transport appraisal. That's correct? Okay. And in relation to it, when I was looking through it, I noticed that there's a table, Table 1. I wonder if we can have a quick look at that. It's on page 25. Now, I might be looking in the wrong area, so I'm looking at you to guide me if that's right or wrong, but I read this table. It seems to be the type of transport intervention and recommended level of transport appraisal for development plans in SDP areas. So I'm assuming that this applies to strategic development plans, and it's the middle column that applies to strategic development plans. Now, as I read through each of these, what has become apparent to myself is there's a repetition of the phrase that the SDP should provide rationale and confirm the principle of delivery. Whereas when we look at an LDP in an SDP area, the level of detail is far more refined. It's looking for a greater level of detail. So, is that correct?
Yes, that's correct.
And I suppose in this situation, what does the SDP not do that? The rationale is there through the cumulative transport appraisal and its options testing paper. And it's providing a principle of delivery. It's saying that there are mechanisms to deliver these. Does it need to go further than that?
Depending on the intervention and depending on the stage of appraisal, no, it doesn't really have to go much beyond that. But the question in this particular plan is the rationale there, or have we just got a big long list of potential projects that might be required? Or are we actually saying that through the cumulative transport appraisal we have a refined list of interventions that are required, and yes, further work is needed, and some of that work can be done through the LDP. So that's why the wording around that schedule one is important to us, and just to be clear on which of those interventions have to be taken forward, even in the shorter to medium term. And then, yes, there will be further interventions that may be required and will require further study as the years go past, as the development builds out, as transport demands change, etc. But the important thing should be that if all of the plan allocation is to be delivered, the rationale should be there for the defined list of interventions that support that land use.
Any response from the authority?
Yes, I would just highlight the fact that we're serving an existing population as well as a future population. We need to achieve lower carbon outcomes in terms of our transport movements, and SPP expects us to do that. The Climate Change Act expects us to do that. We have an even tighter time frame to deliver zero emissions, if that makes sense. And we're reflecting a regional transport strategy that is well informed, does take look at the opportunity, go through the stag appraisal in terms of an objective-led approach. We're reflecting that, and those outcomes are consistent with wider planning policy as well as Scottish Government policy. So it is about, it's not just build out, it's about existing, and it's about modal shift now rather than when new development comes forward.
I feel like there is a solution here in the sense of Mr. Torrance seems to be outlining that with tweaks to the wording, Transport Scotland would be more content with the plan. Is that correct?
Yes, depending on what that wording is, yes.
Now, today is not a question of trying to trip people up or put you under the cosh or anything. It's trying to find a workable solution which works with what Transport Scotland, who are Scottish ministers, advisors in terms of transportation matters. So we'll work through item 6 in the plan, and then I want to come back to looking at the wording of the plan and how that might change to resolve some of the concerns. Sorry, and before I do that, I forgot to do this. If we look at the proposed action programme, just very briefly, you mentioned that, and I think it's item 76 onwards on page 8. Those are the transport actions, is that right? And do those identify all those projects in Schedule 1, or is it just 1 or 2, or you can explain that to me?
Sorry. They identify what's in Schedule 1, and it also identifies maybe other, other say active travel corridors that are on the indicative diagrams in the spatial strategy on the spatial strategy, and it goes through who are the partners for that and whether they're short-term, medium-term, or long-term goals, and then there's obviously a little bit more kind of wording around how we would go about either further studies on that programme or project, and how we would take it forward.
So just looking at this, going back to the rail studies, so it doesn't identify the 4 particular ones. It just looks at improving local services. I guess looking at new stations, it also includes core path plans, which we're not discussing today, and transport interventions, which I'm assuming is the Schedule 1. Brilliant. Okay, thank you. Any comment on that, Mr. Torrance? Nope. Right, if we can look at the clarification on how the provisions in the proposed plan would enable delivery of the transport interventions, I took it from the authority's response before that in the absence of a strategic transport fund, projects would be delivered either through developer contributions, the City Deal Fund, which we've explained before, and an infrastructure levy that might come forward through the planning bill and the transport bill, or a combination of all 3. Is that correct?
Yeah, that would be correct. I suppose at the time of writing, we didn't know the timing of the infrastructure levy, that we thought it might be maybe closer, but it seems that it's going to be a little bit further into the future for that to actually come forward, so it would be the other 2 mechanisms that we would have to utilise for the moment, and if an infrastructure levy comes forward, then that could become part of that package. Yeah.
I would just add that the government has given itself 7 years to bring forward infrastructure levy, which includes parliamentary discussion, given the nature of the levy. So we have 7 years from the date of royal assent of the planning bill.
It's the planning bill, so I'm more afraid with that than I am with the Scotland Transport Bill 2018. Is that correct, Mr. Torrance? Does that include a transport levy as well?
No, it won't include a transport levy, I understand.
Just in terms of the funding there, I think we skipped over the important role that we get just from the capital plans of the Nestrand's local authorities, the grant funding we get from Sustrans through their Community Links initiative, this whole palette of capital funding options that are available, and also the city has bus lane enforcement funding as well. So there is a wide range of different funding mechanisms of different levels that come together frequently to fund those things. So there are two or three specific ones you mentioned, but I was just thinking, well, there's actually quite a lot of other bits and pieces that make up that whole package. And I'm thinking now of package one of the community transport appraisal, which some of those sort of fit into.
Just slowly. You just give me those again. So I've got bus lane fund. I think it's that charging.
Right, okay, let's probably start with. I think it's appropriate just to say capital funding of the local authorities and Nestrans. I think the next most important in terms of this context is the active travel funding that is often diverted or it's taken to the councils via Sustrans. So they provide a variety of different pots of things, and then other elements of funding can come from the Aberdeen City Council have a bus lane enforcement fund as well, which can also be used for sustainable transport measures to promote that shift. And then there are probably called ad hoc funding, which comes out often in terms of specific grants for specific purposes from Transport Scotland. And I'm thinking here of what helped us with Kintor was the Scottish Stations Fund. Now, that doesn't exist anymore, but often you find over a period of time, because Transport Scotland want to promote a particular area, funding packages do become available for specific things at specific times, depending on the policy agenda being promoted by the minister at any particular time. We don't necessarily have too much foresight of that one, but we know from our experiences as transport planners that they do come along from time to time and provide opportunities. There's been bus grants before, there's been bus start-off route grants before, there's been a whole range of things that happen at a particular time which come along periodically, which help us promote the capital and the revenue funding of transport schemes over and above what was just talked about. Is that okay?
Of course, yes, thank you.
Can I add a couple more? I mean, just ones that we get at Nestrans. We've had a regional transport partnership active travel grant recently. It was about 350,000. We have a Sustrans embedded officer, which gives us capital funding every year towards active travel. We've had Smarter Choices, Smarter Places bids, which the councils also have as well to implement measures. Sure there are others, but yeah, there's a whole gamut of bids and funding. Cycling Scotland as well, Nestrans has gone to, so there are a range of levers that we try to maximise our funding to the North East.
But that's useful. So from my point of view, in terms of delivery of these projects, we're not just relying on developer contributions. It's coming from other funding streams. Okay. Now, in terms of the plan itself, the city deal and developer contributions are mentioned at paragraphs 3.6 and 3.7 of the proposed plan. We want to have a look at that. I'm wondering, is that a sufficient hook and or an alert to developers that they may need to make contributions toward transport infrastructure, particularly those interventions mentioned in Schedule 1?
So I suppose it's 3.7 is the key paragraph there. We would think yes. I think a developer would be aware that if they are putting a proposal forward, there's going to be some form of development obligations that they will have to make contributions towards, and that could be transportation, that could be affordable housing, that could be education, that could be a whole gamut of things. It could be co-wheels cars. It could be a lot of these things. So I think they are aware that that's necessary. It is in the plan, and it's obviously also would follow through in local development plans. There would be detailed developer obligations tables in the back of the current Aberdeen City local development plan and the current Aberdeen Shire local development plan, which would detail those out. Yeah.
Would it be more explicit if something here said including those stated in Schedule 1?
Yep, it would be more explicit. Yep.
You've answered some of these, which is useful. Mr. Torrance, in terms of that paragraph, your concern for Transport Scotland is about deliverability. And you've heard that developer contributions may help deliver some of these projects. You've heard the other funding streams. Does that give you confidence that these will be delivered from your point of view?
It certainly gives some confidence, yes. It's not all about developer contributions, we've known that. And depending on how the interventions that are in Schedule 1 are prioritised and delivered over the coming years, it may well be that wider package of investment from both local, regional, Trans funding and potentially national funding that comes into that pot. So yes, it does give some comfort, but does the plan set that out at the moment? Does the action plan set that out explicitly at the moment? That's our concern, is if it possibly doesn't.
Now, in terms of those listed in Schedule 1, are any of them already committed or delivered?
I might pass that over to some of the officers who have more experience with them.
Committed or delivered. Right. Aberdeen City Centre Master Plan, Public Transport Access and Priority Infrastructure. Broad Street is an example of where that already has been delivered. However, there are obviously aspirations to go beyond Broad Street in terms of delivering that, but the first phase of that has been delivered, and it's set an example of how it could be done going forward, and it's been funded by the City Council. Okay, next one. Bus, high occupancy vehicle and goods vehicle priority measures along key corridors. There are extant bus priority measures along key corridors, and there are various studies that have been put in place, like at Queen's Road, where there are examples of where that could be taken forward. They haven't been implemented yet. They are waiting on further agreement with the City Council and the bus operators around the feasibility and the prioritisation of that. There has been less work undertaken at this stage on high occupancy vehicle and goods vehicle priority measures along key corridors, although when we are looking at the low emission zone work in Aberdeen, that would probably be part of the options appraisal at that stage to see if removing some of the heavy goods, the large diesel engines out of the city centre may achieve some benefit.
Sorry, it might be quicker if you just tell me which ones have been committed or delivered and which ones
the
are
thing is
aspirational.
bits of the difficulty is bits of them. It is not a clear that one's done. You can look at that and think, well, that's partially done. We're working on that. There's a bit of narrative behind it. So,
sorry, we don't need to be slaves to this. In terms of, there are some that have been implemented already, some that are committed, and some which are still movable, still need to have feasibility studies done on them, still need further appraisal. I'm just looking at whether or not any can be knocked out.
I would be surprised in the time this schedule was written, which was in October. summer last year and now that we can knock any out. I think that would be quite surprising because we were looking at this being implemented over a 10 to 20 year period. So I don't think we've put anything in here that we can immediately knock out just in the last 6 months or so. And I'm just checking. No. But you can say that in that time between these have written, progress has been made on some of these elements. I'm sorry, it is not necessarily binary. It is it's like when you're downloading your photographs. It's like it's one of those ones on many of these elements.
Okay, and just thinking about your regional transport strategy, the 2013 was the last refresh, and I think there's a review of that document ongoing. So where is that, and how does that fit into the SDP-A?
There's a new strategy being developed to RTS 2040. We've started that process. We've gone through the objective settings. We are seeking to fit it in with the timetable of the National Transport Strategy, which is just out for consultation. So we'd hope probably to have it out for consultation around early 2020.
Okay, and that obviously has the same time period as this plan, the proposed plan 2040. So I'm assuming that the projects in the regional transport strategy 2040 would align quite closely with those shown in Schedule 1.
Yes, there could be a different influence on strategy over the interventions as well, with the new carbon requirements to maybe go for greater mode shift of anything. Then this shows us a way to mitigate the plan, this infrastructure, but we may try to influence that and move away from it slightly with more greater modal shift and walking and cycling.
Right, I think what we'll do, we'll move on to item 7, and then we'll come back to looking at potential interventions to the plan. So, item 7's potential implications for the examination arising from Transport Scotland's representation. Now, I don't think we're in this situation, but you'll be aware that Scottish ministers recently took the decision not to approve the proposed Strategic Development Plan for Edinburgh and the South East of Scotland, CES Plan 2, on the basis of transport appraisal concerns, particularly those from Transport Scotland. I think here that we're not in that situation. I think the situation here is that there has been a transport appraisal. There's been a transport appraisal options paper done, which Transport Scotland aren't querying, and it appears to just be how the plan itself expresses that. Is that correct, Mr. Torrance?
It's certainly fair to say the background to the CES plan was a whole lot different to where we are in Aberdeen. The years, as we set out at the start here in terms of that timeline, that process, that background, that involvement that we've all had in this ongoing appraisal consideration of transport is a different story to what happened in the South East.
So we're going to look at the minute in terms of what we can do. If there is any recommendation that I may want to make to Scottish ministers to modify the plan, but that could be sufficient to alleviate your concerns.
It could be, but again, depending on what the words are, but yes.
Right, so let's have a look at potential, what could be done now. I need to further understand this, so now, when we look at your flow diagram that you provided right at the beginning, just to further understand this, so you prepared your main issues report for the Strategic Development Plan, and on the back of that, there was the initial cumulative transport appraisal.
Sorry, put the mic on. The cumulative transport appraisal work was happening almost parallel to it. Yeah.
That was happening parallel. Then at the MIR stage, then you produced your strategic development plan, proposed plan. Now, where did the cumulative transport assessment fit with that? Did the cumulative transport appraisal give you its recommendation before you produced your proposed plan?
It would have given us the outputs based on the volume of development that was in the main issues report. So it assessed that and looked at it at a, Jeff, you can correct me if I've got the wrong words here, but proportionate across the region.
So what I'm trying to understand here is at what point the cumulative transport appraisal, because what I've understood from today is the spatial strategy has been continued since 2009. There's been appraisal work done up until now, added to over the years. You've produced this new cumulative transport appraisal from 2018 and another options paid, 3 packages investigated. Now, did you at some point choose a package and say, right, okay, to implement our spatial strategy, package 1 is the one to go for, package 2 or package 3? And on that basis, these are the transport interventions that we need, and we're listing them in Schedule 1, and we're going to show them on the figures. Is that what happened? I'm trying to understand.
No, what happened was we took the potential schemes before we had tested the packages. So that's what's in Schedule 1. And then after the bid sites came through for the main issues report, we were able to test those schemes, those potential schemes against it, and we got the packages as a result of that.
Sorry, I'm still in the uptake here. So you need to explain that again. So what I'm trying to understand is how did the cumulative transport appraisal affect your decisions about what you were going to do in terms of where development was going to happen and what transport interventions were required?
So the initial stages of the CTA were running in parallel to the development of the main issues report, and would have informed part of the questions that we'd have in the main issue report, which would have been, say, Western expansion. And as a result of that, what we were gauging from the cumulative transport appraisal was that Western expansion wouldn't be a good idea and it would lead to good impact. So we carried forward the spatial strategy as it was in the 2014 plan and the 2009 plan into the proposed plan. What the CTA did was it looked at the level of development that was proposed in the main issues report, and it came up with a list of interventions that may be required to mitigate the impacts of that proposed level of development, and that's where we got the Schedule 1 from. The options testing came after that, and then that's when the packages came after the options testing.
Right. I think I understand the flow now. But so what's shown in the plan are a range of mitigation measures to alleviate what you thought might happen through the main issues report. Okay. So beyond that, you've then looked at the main issues report and the local development plans, and that has informed the CTA options paper, which again describes 3 packages. Now, have you determined whether any of those 3 packages are the one to go for?
No, not as yet. No.
So what we're looking at in the proposed plan is every conceivable potential intervention Is that right? So it's like package
It's,
3.
it's not every conceivable intervention. I mean, there was some sifting of options that led us to this. And then when we had more information, then we tested those options against it, and then we would have the packages. But I suppose the packages that are in the final part of the CTA would, as we said, they would inform other documents. So the CTA isn't just for the STP; it's also for the RTS and for the local transportation strategies as well. So it feeds into that as to what will go into that, and then they may decide to take forward packages that they options that they feel will deliver both the strategic development plan and the RTS as well. So if there's a issues of demand management or modal shift and so forth, then package 1 might be the better option for that, or it might be a combination of the packages. So.
I'm just trying to understand how you formulated your spatial strategy and your decision to retain the spatial strategy from 2009-2014 onward with the inputs from the cumulative transport appraisal. What I think I've got it now is that you decided not to go to the west based on that appraisal and stick with what you had. Is that right? Right. And on the basis of that, that's why you've incorporated these projects here. After a sieving process, these are the outstanding projects that you think would help mitigate impacts of the plan. Is that right?
Yeah, that is what it is. But I suppose any spatial strategy will have impacts on the transportation network. Any growth will have impacts on the transportation network, and that doesn't mean that you wouldn't carry it forward. The CTA will give you an idea of what the issues are and how you go about addressing it, and that's what the list of transport information options are. It's a guide as to where you should go if you want to make your special strategy work.
Right. I think the point we're at is, what is it exactly in this plan that could be modified, if anything, to help alleviate the concerns of Transport Scotland? And I'll obviously have to look at all the evidence that I've heard today and what's in the Schedule 4 and Transport Scotland's initial response. But is it this ambiguity in terms of the use of potential and may be required?
Yes, I think as I just said, this was a reasonably early list in that process, and it's since been packaged and further defined. So there's some work which is still ongoing, which is going to potentially reduce this or prioritise that list that's in the Schedule 1 at the moment, which will give us a better understanding of what projects have to be taken forward in the short to medium term, which may then influence some of the other projects that are in the list in the medium to longer term. I think that it's that ambiguity that we're all in one big basket at the moment, and by the looks of the wording and the schedule, you need all of them, and they all have to be in place to deliver the full extent of the spatial strategy. When in fact it may be the case that there's a way of prioritising interventions, either based on modes, as we've mentioned, to meet some specific targets around either climate change or active travel or whatever the priorities are in the wider policies. And then, yes, there will be some, even after we've delivered those, where you have to go after some interventions in the network. And then after that, there may be some bigger projects as well. But accepting the fact you have to go through that in a staged process, and there is further work to be done. I think if we had some sort of better development of that understanding in that process, then that would give Transport Scotland more comfort in terms of how that's going to be taken forward over the coming years, and in the context of all the wider work which is going on around the city deal and the strategic transport project review as well.
Well, I have a proposition to you. We'll go through the plan, and I'll give you some suggested potential wording changes and a potential way forward, unless you've already come up with one. If you've already come up with one that's agreeable, we can discuss that right now, but you can also put this down in writing, so after the event today, and I can list what changes you might be proposing in a further written submission request, a further information request, and you can both comment on that. And that would mean that instead of it being today, you're suddenly having to think about how you can change it, what the consequential changes might be. You can have a think about it in the cold light of day after thinking about today's evidence. Does that sound like a way forward?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a way forward in terms of the wording, but I would respond to the idea of prioritisation of transport schemes and transport interventions. We've already discussed what a very variable pot it is that's available for transport, and many of them meet multiple objectives that are very much government objectives, and therefore it isn't a defined pot. It doesn't meet single objectives. How do you weight those objectives? It's not the role of the development plan to prioritise those. It's for the regional transport strategy and partners to actually influence how that, if there is a limited pot of money, we know it has to be prioritised, or alternative sources of funding identified, which may be given by government, or it may come from elsewhere. There's a whole, you don't know what the size of the pot is. And when you're going to prioritise, then you are talking about very different objectives. It's not just about growth, it's about the existing population. And to attempt to try and knock down the list, you can do it in timing, but even that is variable because it depends on when new rolling stock comes through for, you know, and through rail, and that's out with the powers. There's certain things that you can influence, and there's certain things you have to wait for. Some people have to wait a very long time, and other people it comes through more quickly. So the idea of prioritising, and assuming that there's a defined, limited pot of money, I think would be unhelpful. I'd rephrasing in terms of the wording, that we could agree either today or it probably would be better if we could give you a suggestion.
And just need a little bit more clarification from you as to how that would work, because I think David and I are both in the same situation in that, I am in the situation, Sheena and I are in the situation that we have, we're joint authority, and anything that we have done has been the settled view of both councils. So I don't think we're in a position to agree anything today. It would have to come back from yourself, but we did have some discussions there earlier on, and you know, if it's an issue of wording, we are okay with that. If it's an issue that something surety needs to be given to Transport Scotland, that any of the proposals, intervention options would need to go through further studies. Quite rightly, they would. We didn't, we can explicitly state that as they need to go through that. And then I think, picking up on your point there, as in how much progress has been made on some of these, like are they short term, are they long term, are they medium term? Is it the phasing of these interventions as we go? Because some of those junction interventions may be dependent on the rate of delivery, and that's maybe something that we would look at the longer term. And the other ones that are related to active travel and modal shift might be in the shorter term. So I think changing of the words or insertion of some words we wouldn't be opposed to, and we could consider that, but obviously we'd have to go back to our partner authorities before we could agree to anything.
Right, that leads me on to a question of timing, because we're in a summer recess for many authorities. Would you have to go for example, in the normal situation, I would say you've got 14 days to comment and 14 days to reply to one another, so 28-day period. And obviously, we're trying to do this examination. There's a target of 6 months to examine the plan. Rarely it goes on toward 9. My aspiration would be to do this as quickly as possible. So I'd be looking for a response as quickly as possible. I wouldn't have thought it would be very onerous. So it's a question of do you have to go through your committees, or is there some way that you've got delegated power to respond?
I would need to go back and review the minutes of agreements as to how we would respond to that. So I couldn't give you any guarantee of the mechanism. But if we had to convene a very quick meeting, we would obviously do what we could to do that. But I couldn't give you a cast iron guarantee today. Apologies. Yeah.
What we'll do, I'll go through where I've identified at the minute where we might make some minor tweaks that might be agreeable. I'll put that in a further written request to both of you, and I'll give you the regular 14 days. If that becomes a problem, you can tell me, and the reason why it's a problem, and we can look at a different time scale. But preferably, I want to do this quickly, because things in planning move quickly. They can move quickly, and new information can come out. It's not helpful to keep going back and forward. Yes?
Sorry, it's probably a silly question, but would that put a halt to other aspects of the examination? No? So to continue on anyway? Perfect.
Myself and Mr. Seddon will be continuing to examine. There's 21 Schedule 4s. This is one off, well, two we're discussing today, partly of the Schedule 4s. And there's a lot of other work that can be done. Don't worry, we won't be waiting idly for your response. So if we could start in the plan, I think paragraph 3.7, we've already discussed that possibly there could be an insertion to do with Schedule 1. Okay? My only concern there is that obviously you don't have a strategic transport fund, and I wouldn't want a developer thinking that there's a global contributions towards Schedule 1 projects. So obviously you're tied up with your planning obligation circular and what you can and can't ask for. So you can think about that. Paragraph 7.7. Would it be useful to remove the words in the first sentence where? So a cumulative transport appraisal supports this plan and identifies interventions. So we get rid of the where and get rid of may be required. So cumulative transport appraisal supports this plan and identifies interventions to support our growth aspirations. There's no ambiguity. These are required. Okay? Yep. Paragraph 8.7. Well, sorry, we talked about how to meet the targets, and it might be that second bullet point needs to refer to Schedule 1. Okay. And in terms of paragraph 8.7, this is perhaps more of a comment, but there might be somewhere to go in here. The third sentence, over the next 5 years, a range of studies will be undertaken in order to explain whether any amendments to the existing spatial strategy will be necessary. This will include studies on the impact of the Aberdeen Western Peripheral Route transport patterns across the city. Perhaps don't need to refer to Schedule 1 there, but it's whether or not you've talked to me about other studies and ongoing studies, whether or not those need to be mentioned at all.
I don't think we'd be opposed to it. We are committed to undertaking a review anyway. So, I mean, yeah.
I mean, this is me at a first glance looking at this, thinking about it. In terms of Schedule 1, removing the word potential in the heading, summary, so it's summary of transport intervention options. And then within the blue heading, summary of transport interventions options for appraisal. Again, it could just be summary of transport interventions. I don't know, play around with that to make it less ambiguous for yourself, Mr. Torrance. In terms of the paragraph above, the table below summarizes transport interventions identified with the cumulative transport appraisal. Get rid of that may be required. And then possibly at the end, you could add something like, these will require future appraisal and review, but at this stage, they would support the spatial strategy. I'm not saying that's the wording, but something to clarify that at this stage, that's what you require. And I think you were also talking about maybe changing the table itself in terms of timescale, short-term, medium-term, long-term. The only thing I'd say there is, please bear in mind that local development plans also have a time frame, and things that your action plan talks about longer-term being quite long, which may be beyond the next series of LDPs, and you're talking about reserving land in terms of land purchasing, etc. That might tie in request. So there might be consequential changes as well. How does that sound?
I think we can work with that. In terms of maybe potential wording, if it's not unsuitable suggested, but there are some things from the STF in terms of saying that projects will go through detailed appraisals, that, while we've identified these, they will still need to go through future detailed appraisals, and that wording has been accepted by everybody. That could maybe be used again. Yeah.
And just to clarify, the reason I'm proposing these particular tweaks, and it's up to you to determine whether or not that's correct or not, or whether you prefer a different wording, or in fact you want to stick with the wording after what we've discussed today. But what I've taken from today is that you're agreeable that actually these are not really potential. I mean, they might potentially happen subject to review and appraisal, but they are required to support your spatial strategy. Yeah. Torrance, on that basis, if we move forward with a written exchange, is that something you think that Transport Scotland can work with and potentially could overcome your concerns?
We're certainly happy to talk about those changes, and I think the changes to the table, the changes to the wording start to move in the direction of what we'd like to see. Quite whether we can get them end up, we'll just need to see what the words are.
Right, does anybody have any further comments that you'd like to raise? Any other points? No. Well, in that case, as you know, the examination only started proper last week. Myself and Mr. Seddon have been allocated the Schedule 4, so we know what we're working on. We're working away on that right now. And as I say, we're trying to make this succinct examination, which will hopefully get back to you within the time scales, the targets set out in the circular regulations. If and as when we require any further information, we'll be in touch. So, any other questions or comments? No? Well, thank you very much for your time, and safe journey home.